Okay, I will now call to order tonight's meeting of the Evanston Preservation Commission. We do not need a quorum, but since we're not voting on anything tonight, but for the record, we have 9 commissioners present. The City of Evanston's Preservation Ordinance empowers this body to oversee and administer the community's historic preservation program. During our monthly public meetings, we encourage public participation, afford due process through public hearings on proposed landmark designations and applications for certificates of appropriateness, and discuss ways to advance long-range planning goals beyond case review. We ask anyone who wishes to address the commission to sign in. We have the sign-in sheet. Does anyone need to put their name on it? Okay. We only have one item of business tonight, which is to discuss what our feedback is going to be, the historic preservation related feedback on the Envision Evanston 2045 draft comprehensive plan and zoning code. Could staff please read some part of the agenda into the record? Thank you.
Can we do public comment first?
Or you want to do public comment first? Okay. So we'll do public comment first, and then we'll read the agenda, the official agenda, into the record. So, Jack Weiss, you are up first. If you'd like to approach, please introduce yourself, and then you will have 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Oh, we're not live. Okay. Can you see the time in front of you, the podium?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So each person will have 3 minutes to speak tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and if you could please introduce yourself, and then
Hi,
go ahead.
I'm Jack Weiss. I'm a former vice chairman of the Preservation Commission. You all have my notes that I sent earlier today. I've got several comments and questions about some of the content of the section that deals with preservation in the plan. They're too numerous to discuss in detail. I thought there'd be a lot more people here tonight, but so I don't need to rush. But I'm providing this checklist of items that I feel deserve further examination, and I'll just highlight a very few. On page 6 of the preservation section of the plan, there are two parts that discuss the term districts, structures, buildings, objects. I felt that the term districts was missing from both of those, and I think you do deal with districts in addition to structures, and I think that districts is a very critical part of what you do. So I think that word is missing and should be included. Key challenges. Historic preservation efforts play a critical role in advancing racial equity. How exactly can preservation address housing affordability? That seemed to be off the wall to me. I don't know if you've ever addressed that on your commission before. Policies and actions. Some strange terms are introduced here that I don't understand belong with you. Remove barriers. What barriers do you face with what you do? Maybe there are some that I'm not aware of. 4, support adaptive reuse of significant structures. Here we are in a building. Important and timely subject. Adaptive reuse of the Civic Center has been downplayed as a potential site for a new Civic Center. Underutilized space has been used as an excuse for not considering it. Why not consider maximizing a space by incorporating police, fire, and civic activities? I hope that this is one of the items that will be soon on your agenda that you will offer some substantive feedback on. 5, support National Registered nominations for Evanston's historic income-producing resources. What are our historic income-producing resources? That escapes me. 6, require appropriate names for new developments and streets to foster and retain cultural and historical aspect of the community.
There's just 10 seconds left.
Sorry?
I just was noting there's about 10 seconds left in your time.
Oh, geez. Well, you saw my note about the Northeast Historic District has never been signed. I feel it should be. And you saw the rest of my note, so I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up, we have Mary McWilliams. Mary McWilliams.
I'm Mary McWilliams. I've been associated with the Preservation Commission in some form or another since 1976. And first of all, I'd like to say I strongly second the comments that Jack Weiss just made. And I attended the meeting last week, the Land Use Commission meeting on the zoning ordinance, and I was concerned that some things were not there. It did not really deal with preservation. The ordinance as written does not help preservation. I came across a letter I have in my file written in 2005 when the Civic Center was being proposed for local landmark status. Ed Noonan, who was the lead architect in the conversion of the building, wrote this letter, and he said, there are three things that are important. 3 points about the value of the Civic Center to the people of Evanston, and asked that it be landmark celebrated and reused. First, our buildings define our culture, and especially the old ones like Marywood School and the Civic Center. It just reflects to ourselves and others who we are and who we have been. To not continue to use the building is to lose our cultural memory. And I think that point is not addressed in the ordinance that it's been as presented so far. 2, the second point is the landscape at the Civic Center. Buildings don't sit alone on islands. As you well know, the Civic Center came with some significant attachment to the land and neighborhood. To simply remove the building would be like stripping the town itself. And of course, think of how strongly the land conveys the cultural continuity. The third point is the continuous lessons of cultural literacy that the buildings teach us. They contain our ability to distinguish one place from another. They teach our children to save enough of the past to look forward. Look at how cherished our homes are as we remodel and remodel them. Remember, each time that we architects complete a renovation, we are judged not by how well we hang on to the past, but how we set up the future with the past. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think those are points that I think would be helpful to be addressed tonight in your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. Did everyone see the written comments that were circulated? Yeah, okay. All right, we will move on to the agenda, and so we're going to read that into the record.
Pursuant to City Code Sections 283G, 15, 20, 21, 23, and 24, the Preservation Commission shall assist in the development and review of the preservation components of the Envision Evanston 2045 Comprehensive Plan, as well as review the associated city-initiated amendments to the zoning ordinance, providing written testimony and recommendations on their appropriateness for the protection and continued use of existing landmarks and properties, structures, sites, or objects within historic districts, as well as their potential effect on other historically, culturally, architecturally, or archaeologically significant areas, sites, structures, and objects throughout the city. The Commission will develop comments and recommendations for consideration by the Land Use Commission and City Council, the recommending and determining bodies for these matters.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are going to we're going to move through this chapter by chapter, starting with the preservation chapter in the comprehensive plan, while we're all fresh and it's not too late. Cade's going to give us a kind of starting point that he's developed as a result of some of the individual discussions and comments that he's already gotten from us individually. We haven't talked about it yet together as a group. So do you want to go ahead and begin, or do you have anything more you
No,
want
that's
to say
fine.
about
I can jump
process?
into it.
Does anyone have any questions about the process and how we're going to do this? No? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the first thing that I'd just like to address is when I talk about preservation aspects of the plan, I don't mean exclusively the preservation chapter. So I'm going to read quickly the purpose statements of this body and this commission. The first being to identify, preserve, protect, enhance, and encourage the continued utilization and the rehabilitation of resources having a special historical, community, architectural, or aesthetic interest or value to the city and its citizens. Safeguarding the city's historic and cultural heritage. Fostering civic pride in the beauty and noble accomplishments of the past. Supporting and promoting preservation-based economic development. Fostering and encouraging preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation, and preventing neighborhood deterioration. Fostering the education, pleasure, and welfare of the people of Evanston. Encouraging orderly and efficient development. Continuing surveys and studies of Evanston's historical and architectural resources. Encouraging public participation in identifying and preserving historic and architectural resources. When you're reviewing these documents as well as the zoning ordinance, it should be through the lens of these purpose statements, which are purposely broad and powerful, as well as the appropriateness of these documents for the aforementioned reasons in the agenda item that was discussed. So what's kind of the goal of this review? It's really to develop a list of items or recommendations where we find consensus as a board or as a commission based on the discussion prompts. I've spoken to most of you up here on the dais about these issues. Many of you have sent in written comments, and what I did was look for commonalities between all of those, and those are what created these discussion prompts. So we'll go through each one of those chapter by chapter, and then at the end, if anyone has anything additional that they want to bring up, they certainly can.
Would you mind just zooming in just a little bit closer?
I don't know if it lets me go in more than 200%. It doesn't.
You can't like type in 300%.
No.
Okay.
Is it not big enough?
It's okay. I just wanted to make sure it was accessible to everybody.
Chair Dreller.
Yes, sorry.
So at this meeting, is this really just a point of discussion and that in a further meeting, we will develop this letter? Or is it the intent that we're going to come up with all the bullet points that are going to be part of our comments during this meeting?
So do you want me to speak to that?
You can if you want.
I don't think that was my intention, was to come out of this meeting with that exact language. I think it's to present general discussion, areas where we find consensus, areas that seem like priorities, and then I would take a shot at drafting something, and then the commission would review that.
Okay, great.
That could come back at a formal meeting for some kind of review and approval after the new year. Or in the past, we've kind of circulated those and gotten approval individually as well and just sent those, but.
Okay, thank you for the
The
clarification.
idea was to try to, if I understand, the idea was to try to find where we had consensus and where we didn't. And then, just to try to figure that out. So Kate's taken a first shot at it from an individual perspective, and then we're going to see if we agree with what he said. That's great. If we don't, at least we have a place to start, and it's not like a open-ended everything. Did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just, maybe for context at the top, you and Kate could say something about what we're doing now and where this sits in the process of the development of Envision 2045. So we're making this letter goes to land use and city council, one or the other, one before the other. What's the batting order?
So I think the powers and duties of the commission allow you to provide written testimony to any board and commission, and I think it's valuable to provide that information to the land use commission. They have prolonged their review slightly, which allows us to do that, where initially this probably would have been sent directly to city council. So I think the intent would be to inform the land use commission, who then makes they have a statutory obligation to make a recommendation on that. So I think informing that decision for them is important. But then also, there are separate powers and duties related to certain things, such as the zoning ordinance specifically, where our comments are directed to go to city council.
Were there any other questions before he gets back to it? No? Okay, go ahead.
So really briefly, I will just kind of explain generally what a comprehensive plan is. The points in red are the really critical items. This is not really copy and pasted from the plan. This is just my own understanding. So a comprehensive plan is meant to represent the community's consensus and vision for the future. Comprehensive plans serve as a guidebook that assists local planners, government officials, community members to determine and understand the appropriate types of development that should be permitted and encouraged in a city, realizing that each new development creates a lasting impact on the city's design, character, and urban form. It also helps serve as a roadmap for undertaking new initiatives and in coordinating the efforts and activities of other key partners and in influencing policy decisions in a broad range of areas. This is something that is just kind of inherent to preservation, but change it will always occur. A comprehensive plan that responds to local conditions effectively can help address the challenges that change always presents and ensure change works toward a shared vision for the future. When I reviewed the plans and kind of summarized what I saw, the plan so far in front of you, from what I can tell in the language, is a vision to create a more vibrant, prosperous, equitable, diverse, and climate resilient Evanston. In order to achieve these goals, the plan looks to, related to this commission, preserve and celebrate aspects of our current and past identities, and using that built environment as a foundation for future interventions, enhance opportunities for arts and culture, increase housing choice and reduce housing cost burdens, increase density to support economic development activity and expand the tax base to support capital improvements and infrastructure needs, reduce barriers to development and investment in the community, enhance sustainable development practices that create a more climate resilient community, reduce displacement pressures, and ensure the ability to continue and expand community services for vulnerable populations. These are achieved primarily through 7 overarching goals, or what really appear as value statements to me in the plan. And we'll go through some of these. Some of these have really common themes that came out through my discussions and some of your written comments. So these are foster a healthy community, and I'll circle back to these points, but foster a healthy community, strengthen the local economy, prioritize environmental sustainability, invest in transportation options, increase housing diversity, create equitable opportunities for all, and celebrate arts and culture. Some of the comments that I received, and these will be addressed more through the prompts, but some of these value statements, one especially that talks about reimagining our city through human scale design, I think that this was seen as very important to the purposes of preservation and retention of community character. Human scale design should be defined, however, and it should use historic development patterns and forms as inspiration and include appropriate strategies, examples, modeling, and visualizations to communicate ideas and expected outcomes. Enhancing the aesthetics of the built environment through thoughtful urban design. This was another one where there was really kind of consensus from the comments I received that this is a very important value statement that wasn't really extrapolated through the plan. It's seen as equally important, and thoughtful urban design should incorporate and reference Evanston's existing and historical development patterns. Defining what constitutes thoughtful urban design could be included, and the plan could identify and incorporate strategies for how that will be achieved and what built outcomes and quality Evanston citizens expect. To seek more predictive design outcomes, and that can be achieved through design guidelines, modeling, visual aids, examples for preferred treatment approaches, historic design vocabularies, and built environment should be points of inspiration. And strengthen the local economy. One of the common themes based on the value statement, celebrating and retaining Evanston's unique identity and sense of place. This was seen as highly important and related to preservation that needs to be expanded further in the plan, and that Evanston's diverse and geographically specific senses of place should be identified further. And we will start with the preservation chapter. This is the last chapter in the plan, but I think it's logical given the powers of this commission. This chapter focuses on maintaining the cultural, architectural, and historical resources that establish a sense of place and define our community. Preservation is planned to be used as a foundational land use tool to successfully balance and implement long-term economic development, density, housing, sustainability, and cultural goals. Let me just pull up this, and I will zoom in for you, Sarah. I'll just read through the draft policies in the plan first, and then I'll get into some of the themes. But to support adaptive use and rehabilitation of historic buildings, to support the city's economic development and housing goals, to continue to survey and document properties eligible for historic designation and protection, to promote historic preservation tools and approaches in line with the city's growth, housing, and economic development goals, to preserve spaces that embody historic, social, and cultural periods, people, and events, to promote inclusive economic development in historic areas, to establish, maintain, and leverage a range of incentives and programs to address neighborhood rehabilitation and stabilization needs, and to include residents, educational institutions, and other partners in preservation efforts. And what I'll do is I'll highlight each one of these. These can be points for lengthier discussion. They can also be points where we just can say that we find consensus with some of these if we agree. This was the first prompt. How can the preservation chapter better intersect with the rest of the plan? And should there be cross-references within the plan, for example, relates to or implement in tandem with Preservation Initiative XXX? Could this be addressed in an implementation chapter, which is currently not part of the plan? And should the plan include an implementation chapter?
What?
Are we just open to comment on that, or are we?
Yeah, so that was meant to sort of be something for us to consider. So does anyone have any specific thoughts you want to start off with? Go ahead.
All right. Well, I like the idea of an implementation. Our long-range plan, personally, for the Preservation Commission has an implementation plan in it. We've prioritized certain initiatives. I mean, the goal is that this is a 2045 comprehensive plan, so over time, there are going to be goals, some more long-term than others, and I think that it would help guide City Council and the city in general to have that. And I like the idea of cross-referencing too, so that when you're in the environment chapter or you're in the transportation section, you can also understand that there are resources that are transportation resources that have preservation needs, like our historic CTA stations or our historic urban forest in the environment. So those are my quick comments.
Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, my quick thoughts reading through all of this is that it sounds wonderful, and it falls into the category, a lot of it, as Jack has pointed out, of being, I'm for motherhood and apple pie. What I think we should focus on is zoning, the zoning map, and changes to zoning regulations. One of the things that caught my attention, and I don't remember whether it kicks in at R2 or R3, which are still streets of single-family houses, is that you can build a duplex. And I think Evanston has a wonderful history of double houses that fit seamlessly into streets of single-family residential. But you can also build a four-flat. A four-flat is an apartment building. The minute you build an apartment building on a street of houses, you have changed or begun to change the character of that street. So for all of the language that we might spend hours and hours and hours talking about, I think our real focus should be the zoning map and then the changes to the provisions for what is allowed in each of the zoning districts. And one of the things that we all know, which is as true as motherhood and apple pie, is that when you upzone an area, you create developmental pressure, and ultimately that developmental pressure can impact both the character of an area and possibly, sort of secondary or contributing structures that may want to be taken down to intensify land use.
Okay, cool. Thank you. You're welcome to clap if you like. getting back to the implementation, yeah, that's on the agenda tonight. Yeah, for sure. But just getting back to the implementation here, one of the things that we should keep in mind is that we have Preserve 2040, which is very specific to Evanston. It was by Evanston, for Evanston, and this feels very kind of neutral, boilerplate, like, like someone who didn't totally know what preservation was kind of pulling things out of the internet and putting them together and then sprinkling the terms like 2040 here and there. And it doesn't really come together. So for instance, implementation, I mean, we're not just going to sit here and talk about how great preservation is. We want to know, as Stuart said and as Carl said, like, how are we actually going to do this? So the answer to your question, Kate, I think is yes. And if we all have consensus on whether there should be an implementation chapter, I guess my follow-up question would be whether that implementation chapter, if we feel that implementation chapter should be based on what is in Preserve 2040, which we've already discussed at length. Yes, I see Amanda going yes.
Yeah, I agree. I was just to piggyback on what you said, I think this is very vague, and some of the comments we got from the public were asking maybe for examples of what some of those things mean, like tying them back to, I think one of the questions was the income producing properties. I don't know, I'm thinking of the Noise Cultural Center. I don't know if we should put in some examples that are in our, not the Envision, but the Preserve plan into Envision. There's so many plans.
Yeah, I think that would help a lot. I think just specifically, since you brought up the income producing, when an income producing property is listed on the National Register, then it's the property owner is eligible for tax credits. So I think, and that's an economic development tool. So I think that's what that particular comment is about in this comprehensive plan. But in any case, right. I think he's saying he thinks that the answer is yes. Yeah. So if it's okay with you guys, if we know we have consensus on whether we do think that there should be an implementation chapter, and it should be based on 2040, we can move on to the next piece. Yeah?
I was just quickly saying,
Sure.
Also identifying funding sources, like you just brought up the historic tax credit, or Evanston is a certified local government, so through the State Historic Preservation Office, we could get grants to do survey work. So, I mean, I'm probably going to discuss that later, but just in the implementation,
Right.
identifying funding sources and potentially non-city groups and organizations that could help.
I would also say that implementation would include like incentives, and some of you will recall, we've talked about this before, some kind of waiver for permits. We tried a couple times to get that through and it hasn't happened yet, but that could be in the implementation. But just to say, oh, this is all this great stuff, and to not have some plan for doing it is not a good thing. Shall we move on to the next? If everyone's okay, we'll move on to the next. Yeah, I know, but we've already had public comment.
One comment about the implementation plan, because it also may address like the paper, stone, and scissor kind of issue of the list of things, which takes precedent over what, and when they're in conflict, motherhood or apple pie, setback for one adjacent to a historic property, should that setback match that setback, or little things like that I know that will
That's zoning.
be.
That's zoning,
That's zoning, but the need for that needs to be in this plan and then be able to survive into zoning, because zoning is maybe not going to want to deal with that.
So maybe perhaps in our letter, we say something about making sure not only that we have an implementation chapter and that it draws heavily from Preserve 2040 because that's already been vetted, but also that to make sure that it is directly tied and connected to, in a logical way, to the zoning code. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so I agree with that too. Do we? Survive zoning. So if everyone feels that we have consensus on that, we should move on to the next thing.
There are many of these. If it's not specific to what you see here, I would assume that it would be addressed later, and if it's not, you could bring it up at the end. This is a long one. The preservation chapter is ambitious in its expansion of the program. This demonstrates the importance of preservation to balance and also achieve the shared vision and goals within the plan. This balance is critically important. Specifically, the preservation chapter and its goals around survey, documentation, supporting nominations for eligible resources, overlaying federal designations with local protections, and most ambitiously, neighborhood conservation districts and neighborhood planning tools are important as a form of mitigation for portions of the plan that may be seen as having the potential to change the character of the community. Does the Commission feel there is adequate framework for adding this capacity and acknowledgement of funding for future planning efforts to ensure meaningful facilitation of these important efforts?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
I think the
Were you
question
gonna-
is just
Were you going to
there's.
say the same thing, Carl?
Yes, but I have a clarifying question,
Yeah.
potentially. Like at the 30,000 foot square, like we're looking at a potential zoning code that has a lot of as of right development or projects that aren't going to go to the Land Use Commission. But if that project is in a historic district or is a locally designated landmark, it will come to the Preservation Commission. My concern is that the Preservation Commission would then be burdened with zoning discussions outside of our purview. We're supposed to just be talking about our standards and for preservation projects. Do you understand what and I don't want the Preservation Commission to be burdened with all these extra discussions.
Well, I think that's what this is talking. So if the program expands, if we add additional historic resources to the charge of this commission and the city's preservation program, the plan currently does not address adding capacity to make those changes. And should it, is the question.
All right, so does everyone understand the question now? Amanda, go ahead.
Is the question mainly around if we add another historic district or conservation district, rather than, like, my concern is that we'll be burdened if the zoning changes to allow 4 flats, and we're going to see more things come through us, but they won't hit zoning, and we're going to be all of a sudden reviewing apartment buildings that we've never had to do before.
I think the question is more neighborhood planning, neighborhood conservation planning takes time, effort, and money. Is that included in the plan? Or does it just say you should do these things without explaining how it will be done, how it will be funded? And maybe this was somewhat addressed with the implementation discussion that we had.
I think that that's part of the implementation plan, is not just, the implementation isn't just what are the actions you're going to take now that you have all these great ideas, but also how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to make that possible? Do we need to preservation planners, for instance? Carl says yes.
Well, I mean, for a staff of one, this is a lot.
It is, and it could become more. Do we need, for instance, to have more preservation commissioners, or do we need to have meetings twice a month instead of once a month if we're going to have a lot more to talk about, a lot more complex stuff to talk about, building types we've never had to consider before, all that stuff? I think that that's your question, and I think that the answer, the vibe I'm getting is yes, we do need that. But would you be comfortable with it in the implementation plan as a suggestion? Okay, so are you? Okay, so that would be part of that.
I think this third one maybe was also addressed, or it at least came up tangentially. I don't know if there's specifics, but are the general values as well as specific initiatives within the Preserve 2040 plan adequately integrated into this chapter? And should there be a stronger connection between the two documents?
Okay, I have strong feelings about this, and of course, no surprise here, I'm going to say yes, it definitely needs to be integrated. My hope, and this again is like volunteering, Kate, because I don't know if anybody else would be able to do this, but to sit down with this comprehensive plan and with Preserve 2040 and figure it out. To bring some of the most important or relevant portions of 2040 into the comprehensive plan. It does not make sense to me to have this weak document be the primary one when we have this strong document we've already worked out. So that's my thought on it. I happen to feel pretty strongly about that. Go ahead.
I agree with you. I think that what it does is it takes all of our hard work and effort that we put into the plan and puts it into a codified plan. So it kind of institutionalizes our plan. So I like that idea.
Yeah, this is a kind of watered down version of Preserve 2040. It doesn't have, and the way they watered it down is to take out the sort of part that makes you feel alive. That sort of identity that wakes you up and goes, okay, yeah, I'm in Evanston. So that's the part of 2040 that needs to be kind of put in, weaved together with this comprehensive plan. I'm sorry? So we have consensus on that. We can move on.
This one seemed to come up somewhat frequently. Neighborhood conservation districts, they are a very effective and powerful preservation planning tool. I don't know that the plan explicitly defines what they are, how they're to be used, implemented, or managed, and should the plan include those things, considering how powerful this tool can be. Sure. So neighborhood conservation districts, it's almost like a preservation light version is what they seem to call it. Really what it is bottom up preservation that looks at individuality. So it comes mostly born out of neighborhood planning. There needs to be some kind of continuity and physical form within that neighborhood that the neighborhood itself decides is important to protect and preserve, and the neighborhood determines how it will be protected and preserved. So this could be anything from my block has open front porches on it, and that's really important to our identity, and we want to create design guidelines that make sure that those are retained. It could look at this block has more vernacular, affordable structures that are being impacted by second-story additions that increase their value very dramatically. We want to regulate demolitions and second-story additions to these structures to make sure that they maintain their affordability to the community. So it can literally be just about anything, and it's born out of a very neighborhood-specific plan itself, and it's in some cases is even managed at the neighborhood level and not the city level. It's a tool that's very effective in maybe every state but Illinois. I think they're in places that you wouldn't think that they're in. Texas, North Carolina, they're very impactful and effective. I think the only city in Illinois that has them is Urbana has a neighborhood conservation district program.
At the end of the evening, I'm going to end up sounding like a broken record. But again, architects don't design cities. Cities are designed or informed by zoning. Witness the setback skyscrapers in New York, which came out of the sky exposure plane. Cade, there are precedents for what you were suggesting. The original one was under John Lindsay and Jack Robertson and John Barnett in New York in the 70s. And what they invented was the idea of spot zoning, that you could actually say this block is zoned R1, but all houses are required to have front porches of a depth of such and such set back this far from the street. I mean, it's essentially what new urbanism did in the form of graphic codes. But you can, through zoning, fine-grain architectural and urbanistic choices about the character of a place by simply writing them into law.
No, I think that that's important, that we don't do a broad brush zoning, that we look at our contexts of our historic neighborhoods and understand each neighborhood has its own unique quality, and the community in those neighborhoods have a collective identity and what they like. Recently, I was in New Orleans for the National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference, and I learned there that they have a whole system of districts. They have their standard districts with full commissions that see projects, but then there are communities that, like Cade was saying, they come together and they say they want to have certain qualities protected, and then they decide if they want to have full commission review or just a block club that meets together and collectively go over whatever a neighbor wants to do. So you can have it at all different levels, and I think that's kind of a smart thing to do. If we're talking about capacity, then we don't have to have everything come to a full commission.
I was just going to note that, as far as I can tell, the only mention of conservation districts in this is on page 113. It is P 6.2, protect naturally occurring affordable housing and prevent displacement through the creation of conservation districts. So that is one reason to use conservation districts, but there are other reasons to do that. And it seems to me that if we think that conservation districts would be something we would want to have, it could be pulled through and referenced repeatedly as an opportunity. It certainly comes up in Preserve 2040. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that I didn't see in zoning, and I asked Kate about this, is the overlay districts went away, so this would be similar to that.
I'm sorry.
Overlay system.
The current zoning has overlay districts, which are just like geographic, location-specific, form-based recommendations. When we were designing YOU, if it was considered this kind of site, so it had to have this kind of setback. So it's very specific to a place, and those are gone. And I don't know if it's because the zoning has not been fully revealed, or if it's just they're getting rid of that.
Yeah, I think the intention is not to include overlay districts. You're spot on about this being very similar to an overlay district. Historic preservation and historic districts are a form of essentially a zoning overlay, and they have a series of separate form-based standards and design standards that apply.
My understanding about conservation districts is that it does come from, it's a grassroots version. So, when we talk about overlays, we think about like this, but what, yeah. Whereas conservation districts are the neighbors getting together and saying, this is the part of our neighborhood that is meaningful to us. And we want to have a structure for managing that. So that is how conservation districts are typically used. And it is, if we were to do that here in Evanston, it would be path-breaking, truly, in our state. Go ahead.
So I know that there are dozens of block clubs in the 5th Ward, various degrees of meeting and structure, but the problem is how you would communicate to them and how you would enable them to have a role in this process.
Yeah, so this has been discussed before. Some people in the here know that this is something that has come up every once in a while. Conservation districts, they're not known to us here in Illinois very much, but they're, as Cade and others have said, like there are other places. There's total precedent for that. It is absolutely doable, but it only comes up in this one little line in the comprehensive plan. So if we like this idea, this is a thing to emphasize to City Council and the Land Use Commission. So I think that's the question, right?
I think we need to acknowledge if zoning overlay districts are gone, Central Street Neighbors Association fought very hard, and a lot of effort was put into community meetings to develop their own overlay zone for Central Street, and I don't think, I'm going to speak on their behalf, I don't think that they would like that gone. I think they would like to see some way of that being implemented, and I think this is a way for that to kind of live on, because it did win a national award from the American Planning Association, so just throwing that out there.
So it sounds, oh, I'm sorry, Charles, go ahead.
As a matter of fact, on page.
Do you have your mic on?
This time. It's not broken, it wasn't turned on. On page 111, under key challenges and opportunities, there's that one sentence that says that historic preservation efforts play a critical role in advancing racial equity while advancing housing affordability and preventing displacement. And with the idea of the Black Cubs of the Fifth Ward and this concept, it seems that is a tool that
It is, actually. I have that in my notes specifically. I pulled that out. In that particular case, you know, there's also a lot of other critical roles that could be addressed, like climate resilience, like a conservation district, other types of equity. I mean, I have in my notes here, aging in place, accommodating people with disabilities, recognizing the role of women in the development of the built environment. Like, there's lots of different critical roles, and conservation districts could be part of that. It's such a great tool that we don't use here, and I'm not sure why not today, why we can't do that.
Yeah, I just want to, I have seen it in other cities in Dallas. I live there, and they actually do a pretty good job of conservation districts in Dallas. Like, they have some pretty interesting areas. But what I was going to say is, if we really think this is a good thing for affordability, like, we should definitely, I mean, pass that along in our letter. Because, I mean, for those that did listen to the land use meeting on zoning, affordability was like the main reason for the zoning changes across the board to R1s and R2, R3 to have those 4 flats. But if we're saying, in fact, by preserving these single-family homes in maybe the Fifth Ward or maybe South Evanston, the bungalow district, you know, some different areas, if we think that that's actually more beneficial than having developers buy up those plots and build 4 flats, then, like, I think that needs to be part of a conversation somewhere, because I definitely don't think people understand conservation districts here at all, or even know about them. Forget understanding them. They don't even know they exist.
It used to be a topic of conversation, but it's not anymore.
No.
One thing we could do, just as a side note, is we could bring a speaker here to talk about conservation districts at our meeting.
Another thing that you could do is, instead of bringing people here, people like us that are concerned about it could go to ward meetings
Exactly.
and share the information.
Well, and maybe
could, but we
maybe
need to make
do
sure we
a
have
bus
the-
tour of because I know that Mary McWilliams organized a bus tour of the Fifth Ward I think it was in the 90s.
Yep.
96, you said? Okay. For the Conservation District, I think it was Alderman Kent at the time with the Fifth Ward. So the work has been done. It's just we have to kind of unearth it and
Right.
bring it back to life.
And make sure that it's mentioned, not just here and there, but that it kind of has an identity within this plan. What I was going to say is that having a speaker come and educate us about what conservation districts are, and going out to the ward meetings, those things are not mutually exclusive. So we could have someone come and give us their expert ideas, and then we could have some thoughts. But that's a side thing that I'm happy to work on at some point in the new year. But I think it sounds to me like we have consensus on this. So shall we move on? Is everyone okay if we just move on to his next? He said in such a gentle voice, "There's more." So
There's a lot of zoning questions, Stuart.
yeah.
I think these two you briefly tied into the last conversation, but does the chapter adequately address other types of equity and their complex intersections with historic preservation, such as the ability to age in place and accommodate people with disabilities and other accessibility needs? I think this is a recurring challenge for historic structures to meet some of these needs in a community.
I think that goes to the whole point of the national trend to live in place, and we're going to have a lot of people trying to adapt their homes to live in place as people, become older and they have to adapt with either a ramp or some kind of chair lift up to the porch, to get into their house. So that might be something that is worth addressing.
That's also the more climate resilient approach, just so that, because that's another thing that is claims to be a big goal behind all of this is climate resilience. So keeping the building is more climate resilient than tearing it down and building something new.
So
Stuart-
aging in place and the whole question of adding ramps to the front of historic houses is an interesting question, and I think you could address it by actually making ramps an allowable exception in a side yard.
So I think that it sounds to me like our answer is no, and that we have a consensus on that. Yeah? Yes. Okay, all right.
Okay. Should this chapter more explicitly recognize the role of women, minorities, and other lesser acknowledged identities in the development of Evanston's built environment and contribution to our cultural heritage? Or do you think it adequately addresses those things currently?
Do you have some example of how that may happen or how it may look?
I think this is more of a context question when it talks about preservation and the context of our built environment, and if we adequately represent these people in that language, or if there are policy statements to look at more cultural designations that look at these, at landmarking some of these sites or buildings. Sometimes the buildings are no longer existing. Or this could also be more living heritage. There could be stories and collecting oral histories. I think this is one thing that the Preserve 2040 plan addresses pretty well that I don't think is necessarily translated into this document.
On page 112, policy number 4 says preserve spaces that embody historic, social, and cultural periods, people, and events. And so if I understand what Kate is asking us is, do we feel like that section in particular is robust enough? For instance, for P4.4, support creation designation of a cultural historic district that celebrates residents of color and other underrepresented populations. So is that enough? Does that go far enough? Do we want to say more?
I think, did that question ask about women too, I think?
Women, yeah.
I mean, I don't think it says it in the envision part, but it should probably say women too, because they're usually not acknowledged in the same way that men are.
Yeah, I mean, well, I've been on the commission there. I don't remember a single building that we've reviewed that was designed by a woman, like a landmark. They're all designed by men.
I also see this, I think it's in Preserve 2040. I'm getting the numbers mixed up, sorry. Our long-range plan for the Preservation Commission acknowledges that Shorefront did a marker program for significant properties of African-American heritage, and I think that maybe ties into the standard, but it's not really clear that it would.
The
way
one,
it's written.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one thing about this P4-4.4 that struck me is that it says support creation and designation of a cultural historic district. So that's fine. That's what I suppose we would want. But I think that for me, I would rather have it say something like, work with them for what those populations want. If they don't want to be in a district, do they want a conservation district instead? This was some of the issues that were being discussed many years ago, and I think we need to reevaluate how we talk about the options that people have, so that. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Joe.
Well,
I see you wanting to talk.
Well, I think that it's hard to fit that into our historic traditional kind of preservation role. But on the other hand, Shorefront does a great job of that. So is it more of a collaboration, or we bring this as a support entity that we work with them to accomplish this, and maybe what we say is that we do everything we can do in cooperating and working with Shorefront to promote this concept, because it's hard for me to fit into a strict preservation role.
There's no reason for us to try to fit it in to say that it should be a historic district. And it's not just Shorefront. It could be our friends in the Native American and Indigenous research over at Northwestern or in Evanston Latinos. You know, there's lots of organizations that we could ask, how do they want us to help them celebrate and protect their heritage? And this is what Preserve 2040 does really well. And so I think that the answer is no, that this comp plan isn't really robust enough, personally.
That's great feedback.
Right? Yes?
I just wanted to, yes to what we're talking about, but can someone give some background as to why the Conservation District that was spearheaded by some of the folks here tonight didn't end up becoming a Conservation District?
I think it's probably mostly just misunderstandings about what it actually was and how it would be implemented, and I think fears that it fit more of the model of a traditional historic district, and those residents not wanting to be bound by those restrictions. It's also can be very complicated to apply those standards to a more culturally based, even vernacular structure. It doesn't need to have the same architectural integrity to effectively communicate its past in the same way.
And then procedurally, like how would these interested communities become a conservation district? So let's just say we've educated communities that want to do this, they're on board. Like, is this something that the city does, the state does, that like, is it codified? Like, I don't understand what happens
It's something the
next.
city facilitates, and that goes back to kind of this other question about neighborhood conservation districts is this plan kind of talks about it, but it doesn't necessarily specifically say codify a neighborhood conservation district program, which is a really powerful action statement. Like, we will do that, and then you'll kind of see how that works, and there'll be meetings, and you'll understand. Because I think it can be pretty varied, but the answer is yes, it's codified into some, typically a preservation ordinance.
Would that be part of a implementation plan? I mean, that's what you're talking about, is implementing this idea that we're talking about.
Or it's an action statement under that policy. That's,
Yeah, it could be
it
an
just
action
says
statement, yeah.
And the other thing is that, we go back to this thing about reinventing the wheel, like we were just talking that this very thing is happening in other places. So, we just adapt as much as we steal as much as we can.
I always said do a little R&D, a little rip-off and duplication.
There you go.
Is not a bad thing.
I'm gonna just take advantage of the fact that we have some people in the audience that actually know about this stuff. Can I ask
was gonna
you?
ask that.
Yeah, no, not now. Yes, thank you. So not now, but in the future, would one of you or some of you be interested in coming and speaking to us about your work with the conservation districts? Okay. Well, I'm not intending to put you on the spot. I just want to, because you're here. Okay. All right. So we do have a potential speaker situation set up, or it's in my mind now. So we'll try to make it happen, and then we'll have a more focused conversation about that. Okay.
This is actually the last one in this chapter, and then there might be many questions that you have that are covered in other chapters. I don't know if a better approach would be just to go through those and then maybe ask questions after. But this one, reinterment and repatriation of ancestral remains and cultural objects has come up at multiple commission meetings. Should the preservation chapter call more explicitly for identification of a location to accommodate this? Currently, the plan only talks about increasing consultation with tribal organizations and tribal nations.
I'm not sure, but little bit I know about this topic is that there's a major effort to keep those spaces secret.
That's required by federal law to keep them secret.
Right. So it gets pretty hard to identify an area, and I don't know what you
I think
do
that sometimes the state will identify things as kind of neutrally as like kind of a utility easement or something like that, that somehow on a map doesn't look, they don't identify it as a significant Native American or site, but somehow it's internally they know, but then on a public-facing document, it's not revealed. You're right.
Yeah, they have procedures for that. But the question is whether we want to encourage this comprehensive plan to actually say, look, there needs to be a place when remains are found during construction projects, for instance, during Ryan Field construction. If remains are found, what happens to them? Because right now, as we heard from our speaker a while back now, you know, they go to the morgue, which is not very respectful. I would like to just note that it is kind of, you know, we've been talking about all the weaknesses here, but I do want to just acknowledge that there is actually something in here about Native American consultation with tribal historic preservation officers, because I suppose some plans might not say that, and so I want to just acknowledge that they did, the folks that put this plan together did hear us on that. So it might not have been in there if we hadn't spoken up.
Well, I think that because there's a relatively new state law that kind of people are still trying to understand how to implement it at the state level and the local level, I think it would be helpful for the city to have some kind of procedure in place to help us navigate that new law.
So, so this is a P6.6 on page 113, increased consultation with tribal historic preservation officers. And so we're saying, we're asking that that be more robust too, and that specifically we talk about in a reinternment site. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, were there other things in this particular, we have a lot to talk about still, but were there other things in this particular chapter that you all brought with you, like major things that you think we might have consensus on after our conversation that you want to talk about openly?
I think it would be helpful to have some statement about potential eligible districts or landmarks, more about that, that there is the commission has a study list, and what does that mean? When there is a study list, it's just identifying things as eligible as a landmark, but then if there's a development that happens on that parcel, what happens? Nothing, currently nothing. Is there a demolition delay that potentially leads to time for the city to come to the commission and say, we know that you have identified this as a significant property within the certain delay period? Would you like to address that before the plan moves forward?
And we do, I do ask that question in the zoning portion. Those demolition delay provisions can live in a variety of locations. So they can live in a preservation ordinance, they can live in the building code, they can live in the zoning code. So I asked it in the zoning portion, but we can certainly address it now.
I mean, I do think that in this comprehensive plan preservation chapter, there are lots of opportunities to remind people that we have this eligible study list and that it is meaningful to us. So I would be perfectly happy to integrate that a little bit more and make sure that
And then
it's
just for everyone's familiarity, the way it works typically is it doesn't have to be exclusive for just properties that are eligible. There could be demolition delay provisions for any proposed demolition. You can enter into, it's typically a 90-day hold. That can be released much sooner than that 90 days, but what that does is it allows someone with expertise at the city to assess the cultural, historical, architectural significance of the property and whether that should be referred to the commission for potential landmark nomination and protection, or if it doesn't have, if it's not historically, architecturally significant, the hold can be released and the demolition can go through. But without that, someone could inevitably pull a permit for demolition and it can be issued and the resource is gone.
I just want to comment on that. I think that's a good tool, but that tool is rather reactive. Like someone wants to demo, they pull a permit, and then you're like, wait, stop. Like, I mean, I don't know how we can incorporate this, but how can we be more proactive by converting some of those things from the eligible list to actually be a landmark, or like instead of waiting until there's this like fire drill where everyone's like, wait, stop, this is important. Oh my gosh, let's, like that. I'd prefer if maybe we had a plan where we prioritize some of these and tried to like tick through them every year somehow.
Yeah, that's in Preserve 2040.
But if we could somehow incorporate this into this plan for the city
So,
in some way.
so I think a follow-up to that is on the study list, there are numerous buildings in our downtown that are listed as eligible landmarks. Could be a multi-listing National Register district nomination similar to the suburban apartment district we have where they're sprinkled throughout. And that would potentially, I see it as, we could use it as an incentive to potentially be a National Register district and landmarks so that those buildings could then be revitalized and then they open up to historic tax credit and because they're landmark, the Class L property tax freeze. And so I think that would be the more proactive way of doing it.
I also, and I don't know how familiar you all are about this, there is a district type, which I don't know whether we have them, I can't remember off the top of my head if we have any in this area, that is called a discontiguous district. We do, okay. So a discontiguous district is exactly what it sounds like. You don't just draw a line around where all the stuff is and everything inside is the district. The discontiguous district is like literally sort of conceptually connected rather than geographic.
Yeah, I think that
Like a
was
thematic
that
or
was a
something.
thematic, and we currently have it's a suburban apartment.
That's what that is,
And I
yeah.
think that was, if I'm correct, at that time there was a city manager that was aware that there was a lot of conversions of apartments to condos, and they wanted to have some way of assisting those property owners in rehabilitating those properties, so they put them on the National Register so they could use, I think,
As a
the tax credit.
discontiguous district.
Yes.
We have,
Yeah.
we have a separate criteria that talks about that properties don't have to be contiguous to be part of a district.
Yeah, so it's just something to keep in mind. It's not super common, but when we talk about districts, we just need to remember that we have this other tool. And some people, when they hear district, they're like, oh no, it's going to just give everybody a big, just sweep everybody into it, but that's not necessarily the case. If the resources are related conceptually rather than geographically, something like firehouses, for instance, that are designed to be at very specific places, around a city, could be, I'm not saying ours are, but that's the typical discontiguous district type of thing. I've written one or two of those in my career at the National Register level.
I get, on this chapter, there were some ideas a while back about building a large building on the parking lot next to the library. But should there be some kind of part of the building permit process that they would be required to determine the impact that it would have on adjacent historic things? So there's the Willard House right there. So should there be are you saying they already have this? That they would have
No, I'm
to,
not- no,
that they
I'm
would
not
have to
saying that.
basically provide an impact statement to say this is how this historic space would be affected by this construction.
Well, I have a few things to say about that when we get to the zoning code, but it happens that Kate and I just talked about that exact thing within the last 24 hours. You want to?
Yeah, there's, so we do not have those powers in our zoning ordinance, or most commonly that would be in a preservation ordinance. There are many municipalities across the country, and there are precedent for commissions having advisory review powers for adjacent properties to landmarks. That's not atypical.
So are you saying, how do you all feel about that, Charles or others, if that is something that we want to suggest?
I think it's very important. I think it brings it front and center. It makes it part of the conversation. If you don't ask, you lose it. And like you were talking about, arguing from a point of weakness, I think we need to state clearly about the importance of the integrity of the site, the ability to see it, for instance, and not have it be blocked by a building, that's how you're going to get full enjoyment and full appreciation for it, by having a situation where, rather than being obstructed, it's given some focus, for instance.
I do want to just note, and this goes back to the capacity issue, because so far tonight, we've talked about districts, different types of districts, conservation, neighborhood conservation districts also, right? The study list, and creating some structure for bringing them to our purview here. Plus, now you're talking about all the, if I understand correctly, all the sites that are adjacent to landmarks too would have some kind of variation on review. So that, in that case, we definitely need to remind everybody that we can't do this without having more capacity, because it's not physically possible.
Just a clarifying, so are you saying when you review of adjacent properties to a landmark, are you saying that if someone was proposing work on a property next to that landmark, that would also trigger a review or a COA, or?
There's so much in between here, and the specifics have to be worked through. I mean, they can be, I've seen examples where the only time that advisory review comes into place is when a structure is either the parcel is vacant and new construction happens, or it's demolished and new construction happens, and it just allows an opportunity to explain what a more compatible, sympathetic design could be for that building. It's always advisory.
Right,
Well-
because that just doubles the number of landmarks we have in the city then.
Yeah, but I mean, how do you control that situation so that you tell people up front that they can't build a 20-story building 15 feet away from the Willard House? You
Yeah,
know,
I mean,
where-
that's why-
Where does that level of control happen, and happen in a general enough way that we're not reviewing everything, being every new project that's bigger in scale than the landmark it's being built next to?
I don't think you can control that. I think there are cities that have examples where you can give that feedback on what you think is appropriate and what isn't. Usually it's associated with a hold on the permit being issued.
I mean,
but you
there
can't
is a way to
control it.
do that, but you can't do it in this country because it's, you know, property rights, and if you downzoned that parking lot so that you could only put up a 6-story building or a 4-story building there, you'd be taking value. And sadly, you know, the cultural value of landmarks just don't count when it comes to capitalism.
Well, I mean, I thought that you said that there were some options. There's some places that actually do it.
I asked if there were some
I'm saying
options.
I've never seen an ordinance with something like that where you actually have determining powers.
Right, no, it's just
is what I
review
understand.
under very
Correct.
specific circumstances.
Providing some kind of consultation
Right,
on what
right.
is more appropriate.
I agree. I think that's the point. The point is, it's something that deserves attention. However, down the road, the authorities, the people, whoever determines the value of that, that's what will drive it. We have all kinds of laws and rules and regulations. Preservation is exactly what Stuart is saying about taking value. But the point is that there are ways that other values that are maybe outside of just straight economic that are appreciated. I would hate to see, like the Willard House, to be totally overwhelmed by a huge building built up next to it, with a no setback.
So what was invented in New York City in the mid-'70s was a situation where you could make that parking lot its own zoning district, and you could then say that on the first 40 feet of that parking lot, you could only build a building that was 4 stories in height. And to get people to develop it, you would then say, well, You know, the zoning for that site says you can only put up a 20-story building, but if you build the first 50 feet at a height of 4 stories, then you can have another 10 floors of development space. Because it's really the way the building addresses the scale, size, and height of the Willard House that impacts the street.
So,
I think-
so you're taking the air rights
Yeah.
of the, yeah.
Yeah, so that's air rights.
Well, you're using the sort of stick and carrot approach, basically.
So,
But
so
you're
we,
doing it on a very specific site, and zoning doesn't really currently allow for that.
so one thing that we could say, just to refocus on the comprehensive plan for a second, is we could say that we want some kind of discussion about that when a landmark is designated. I mean, we would have to go back and look at, figure out how to do it for the existing landmarks, but going forward for new landmarks, which hopefully, as Amanda pointed out, we have a whole bunch on the study list that could be. So part of the process of landmarking could also include some conversation about what is going to potentially be allowed on the adjacent properties and go from there. But that is not going to happen if we don't say it in the comprehensive plan.
I hate to complicate things, but it kind of is wonky if you get into the preservation law of it, you know, what is a taking?
Right,
And when
absolutely.
when can a taking, what is a taking and when can it happen? Can it happen on private property? Can it happen on a city-owned lot next to the Willard Center, Willard House, or?
Yeah, no,
So-
it's a complicated question for sure, but that conversation will not happen if we don't actually prompt it here. So the question, I guess, that is whether you all would like to say in our letter that, you know, we'd like to see some kind of conversation about that, some sort of protections for, on adjacent properties for landmarks.
I think this is actually like a really great opportunity, like to what Stuart said. Like we have this intractable sort of argument about keeping Evanston the way that we all feel this sort of warm and fuzzy. We love our neighborhoods. We love the way that it looks, but we need affordable housing. And I think what I hear from people who are, you know, really nervous about, you know, changing their zoning to allow, you know, apartment buildings. They don't know what that's going to look like. They don't know how it's going to feel. And they don't know that there's going to be any sort of guidance for that. What are the rules going to look like for that? Are they going to put up some sort of monstrosity? Is it going to have, you know, 100 new people on my block that currently only has 100 people on it? And preservation could really, you know, take up a space of a check and balance, a place where we're, you know, homeowners and neighborhoods, I mean, possibly with this other kind of, you know, community, like conservation district. But I think preservation is in a unique position to make people feel more comfortable about bringing, you know, higher zoning into their neighborhoods. I mean, you can't have more affordable housing unless we build it. We have to build it somewhere. But there also needs to be checks and balances to that. And I feel like, you know, to Stuart's point, like, hey, like with, you know, a board full of architects and, you know, people who are thoughtful, you can build, you know, thoughtful apartment buildings and fourplexes, but there just needs to be some sort of structure around that. And I don't know where else that would come from other than preservation, perhaps.
I think that what you're saying too is having design guidelines or making it more prescriptive so people know, okay, this is the lot I have, and this is what I want, and this is what it can look like, so that people understand what it helps the process.
I mean,
right?
this is bold, but, you know, I mean, at least, I mean, if people are talking about, you know, preserving the way that their neighborhood feels, like if someone comes to build an R4 in a neighborhood that only is R1, like, can that go in front of like the expanded Preservation Commission to provide some, you know, possibly there's already prescriptive, guidelines in place perhaps, but also a check and balance on what this neighborhood looks like. Give a possibility for neighbors to come and speak on it. Some sort of space to do this. And speaking to that in this plan, I think this plan, everyone's talking about affordability, but I don't see anything in this plan that actually will allow that to happen, that won't enrage a good portion of the city. So, how do we get this really important thing? We all struggle with NIMBYism. There has to be some sort of mechanism to deal with these feelings and to also provide guidance.
Well, I think we also maybe give an example in the plan of what we've done, already, what we are doing. The Lakeshore Historic District, the statement of significance for that district is primarily based on zoning. It's for a single-family home district, but this commission has seen projects for accessory dwelling units and rear additions in that district. So you could be walking up and down Michigan Avenue, Judson Forest, and you don't know that you have density and you have additional
You're
housing.
100% right. And in the short time that I've been on this board, and I think for you who've been here longer, we've seen how this board approaches ADUs in a much different way than they were approached 5 or 10 years ago. Obviously, the law changed, but the law changed, it didn't necessarily change the way that preservation had to look at these things, but we felt like that was part of. We're team players. We're part of the city. The city, passed laws that allowed for ADUs to more easily be expanded, and we've allowed for that space to be created. And I think we could do that in other spaces too. Does that make sense?
That makes ultimate sense, and that is a perfect response to this, because I think what we're doing here is we're taking a lot of information and plans that support development, and we're trying to make it more human.
Yeah.
We're trying to lay on this the fact that people have to see it, people have to feel it. People want sun on their faces, people want to walk under shade trees and stuff, and having zero setback or no allowance for permeable areas. That's one side of it. The other side is to have adequate green space and canopy, and so it's a struggle between those two. But my faith is that with good development, like you said, good design, intelligent people working to do good things, that good things can happen. But as was stated, it has to be on the table. It has to be something that people understand is something that needs to be dealt with.
There's an answer to this, but it's generally an unacceptable one, which is that you have design guidelines. For instance, the whole issue of how you build on a residential block that's single-family houses, if you were going to put up a 6-flat, is that the design guidelines require that you build on the site in a way that puts 2 units again on the street and then 4 units at the back of the site, so that it bulks up in a way that doesn't overwhelm the adjacent structures or the adjacent houses. But those are design guidelines, and I think you need an extraordinary level of buy-in to begin to attach something like that to a zoning ordinance.
Certainly, there is no reference at all in this to design guidelines, as far as I see. Thomas? Lisa?
So a lot of, some villages have contextual design commissions, which would kind of take this off, they have contextual design commissions, which would take this off our plate as preservationists and put it on a different plate. If zoning's going to change that much, it might be something,
I know there is support on city council for a design commission or some kind of committee, because there was a design and project review that was essentially a pseudo open staff meeting that people would come, you could come to, and they would do that. They would talk about design, but I think that would be a nice idea, is to have that extra body be the one that takes over that responsibility.
One thing that I like about Lisa's suggestion is that, you know, Josh, what you're describing makes total sense, but the only things that we're reviewing is like 10% of the city. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that also might need some guidance. Might not be necessarily landmarked property or adjacent to a landmark property, but it's something that's important to the community for one reason or another and might need a little bit of assistance. So that's where Lisa's suggestion kind of comes in, because I think we do a pretty good job of helping people with contextual design, but there's 90% of the city is not in our jurisdiction, technically.
Well, what about the idea of design guidelines for properties that are adjacent to landmark structures? I mean, there's certainly nationally a lot of precedents for design, the use of design guidelines, some of them good, some of them questionable. I mean, you can build anything you want in the town of Santa Monica as long as the exterior stucco in it has a clay tile roof. And that's a design guideline that for many, many years has absolutely controlled the visual character of that place.
Thomas, I think you were waiting to speak.
I was just going to say, it seems like, not to steal the meeting's thunder, but to Stuart's point, we're going to eventually talk about zoning, and I think maybe we should put a pin in this conversation about design guidelines and a separate commission to style police, because what we're saying is we only need that if we're gonna say you can radically change, you can build a whole lot more, but we want to take a look at it first. We can say that there's a lot of character, whether or not it's in a historic district or not, that shouldn't change, and so let's not make a problem that we have to solve with guidelines. That's just another way to think about this.
Yeah, well, they've created the problem we have to solve, right? Because we're reviewing.
Well, we get to decide how we respond. Yeah. So
So the current response to the current draft zoning would be that we would, it doesn't have to be design police either. I mean, I think that there's ways of doing it that are more collaborative. But if this isn't a consensus, I mean, our point here is to try to find consensus for our feedback. If we don't have consensus on including design, some references to design guidelines in the comprehensive plan right now, then we can move on to our next thing.
I don't know if by saying we are okay with design guidelines, we're also saying we're okay with the 4-flat, because then I don't agree.
So can we put, that's why I was saying if we put a pin
Yeah,
in this until we
I
get to
think
the end.
that's
Because
what
I
I
think
mean.
if everybody agrees that it is, then we should
Right.
put that in. But
That's
it
how
seems
I
like the
feel.
two are connected.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem like we have consensus right now on whether design guidelines should be included, so we can just say no for now and move on to the next thing.
Can I quickly add one thing is that this commission functions with design guidelines. Whenever anybody comes in front of us, we have a set of criteria that are sort of spelled out, such that when we say to somebody, well, we want you to go back and rework this design, it's because the proportion of openings, continuity of street facade, we've got a whole list. Those are, in fact, design guidelines, and I wonder if for blocks that have landmark houses, if we just take the criteria we already have and try and get it written into the
standards, you mean, and have that,
yeah, the standards.
Yeah, so maybe some, when and if we get to that, some reference to the standards and applying those, having maybe some more expanded thing. I wanted to say one other thing, because this time now is about anything else about the chapter, right? This chapter 9. One thing that I did not see very, very much that I thought needed to be discussed and tied together a little bit better is a deconstruction ordinance. it's mentioned here and there. I'm sorry, deconstruction ordinance. It is mentioned here and there, but I do think that there are lots more opportunities to make it clear that this is something that is a priority for us.
So I was withholding comments on that for the environment chapter, but do you want me to?
Well,
potentially-
it's relevant to preservation, I
Right.
think, too, so.
I mean, so
Go ahead.
Let's see. Where do I? Because I think it's in our Preserve 2440 initiative, policy 3.3, to integrate and expand preservation priorities which align with the climate action and resiliency goals. And I know we've started discussions about a deconstruction ordinance. We're at the beginning. I mean, do we want, because I don't really want to put it in there that what it should be, because we don't know yet, but
Well,
I think
maybe
that-
I can just respond to, the policy statements and action statements in a comprehensive plan are relatively general, so I don't want this panel right now to get into the weeds of what any of these would look like. Something that would be in a comprehensive plan would be codify a deconstruction ordinance as an action. It doesn't have to get into the specifics of what that would look like.
yeah, like ENV 8.2, which is on page, chapter 569, reclaim and reuse building materials. So that doesn't feel robust enough to me, just as an example. So it would seem to me that we could encourage the final version of this comprehensive plan to be a little bit more sort of proactive about deconstruction.
I think that's a great example where that same language could be adjusted to say codify a deconstruction ordinance in order to, and what it already says.
So do that.
Yeah.
So does that feel like something that we have consensus on, to kind of find ways to remind people that this is something? All right. Other, Lisa, go
I
ahead.
just have, so you guys have, I'm new to this board too, but you guys, this map that's included, for the general person reading this, I mean, it's awful.
Yeah.
There's no eligibility district, there's no discontinuous district, there's no list of homes that aren't in this that are important, and there's no resources.
Are you, it's just for the record, you're talking about page
Page 109.
109,
Yeah.
yeah. That, I have all kinds of
That
comments
was a
about that.
common theme that from the comments I received was to, one, just better graphically represent what's already there, but then to include additional layers of complexity. So that's eligible districts, eligible landmarks, individual landmarks, the suburban apartment buildings, which is a thematic
Right.
resource, to include all of those things, because graphic examples and like a map, they're very powerful communication tools, and they can really help inform policy decisions moving forward. So I think that is really important feedback.
And may I suggest using technology, because we are in the 21st century now, potentially instead of a static map, using kind of like a ArcGIS, very light map, so it doesn't take up a lot of, web presence data, but so that you can turn on and off layers, and, you can actually like plug in an address. I think that would be helpful instead of a static map.
Or in addition to a static map. I think we need to make sure we have some. So
I'm
that,
sorry, but in addition, we have so many resources, and can we tie them to this? I mean, yeah. I mean, if.
You mean
if-
like having like the 850 local, preserve,
Landmarks.
landmarks, on that
Identified.
map as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm just, this is not going to be very kind, but if I just moved here and I read this, I wouldn't know what you guys have been doing for the last 40 years.
I agree. It's very, very
Fluffy.
rough.
Fluffy.
It's a very rough, beginning point, not an actual map. So that's a good comment that I think we have consensus on that, it seems. So we should include that. Any Additional comments?
Yeah, I have a comment. I don't know where this fits in, but frequently we get projects from the city and that come before us for advisory review after they've been in the works for like a year plus, and it's sort of like there's really no chance to stop the moving train, I feel like, no matter what our feedback is. And so I don't know where we can put this in, but we are a city commission. I feel like we should have a closer communication with the city on city projects that would come before us. So we don't see them at the last minute where it's like, they're not, I think people aren't as willing to change when they're so far down the path than when they're earlier in the stage. So I don't know where to add that, but I would personally like to see that because it's come a few times while I've been on this.
I think some of this goes back to, in preservation planning as a profession or just planning as a profession, action statements, policy statements, those mean very specific things, and there's intentional language that you're supposed to use. There is language in here about capital improvement plans or capital improvements following preservation best practices. That could be expanded to be more of an action statement, to say that there's to develop some kind of procedure or something, or maybe even develop some kind of guidelines for what that looks like. So I think that's good feedback.
I think also I have concern with District 65 released a study of all of their schools, and they said that some of the schools were, quote, at the end of their life, and some of them were Washington, some of our cherished historic schools, and I'm concerned now with the fiscal condition of the school district if we would have some say in those schools, because it's a public body. We don't necessarily always review work that's done on them.
I would say for sure that feels like a big omission. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I'm going to say something else too, and I am not sure that Preserve 2040 addresses this particular issue as much as it might need to. And I'm looking at Carl because
I don't think it was as much of an issue when it was written.
Yeah, a couple of years back, but it has become. So I don't think that we can assume that what we talked about earlier in the meeting, where we're going to try to fold some of the 2040 stuff into this, is going to actually do this job. It might need like another policy.
I would think, I'm going to throw this out, I don't know if this is possible or not, but it's almost like we need to revisit an ordinance. I don't know that this is an important issue, because I know that Public Works, they do a lot of things, and maybe they don't care whatever the reason is. And when we say District 65, maybe we need to work on an ordinance that specifically says that these things need to be, that the process by which they undergo catastrophic or major changes needs to be more supportive of the preservation goals.
So I wonder, Kate, if that kind of thing would end up in the implementation chapter, or would we?
Well, I mean, the implementation chapter is reflective of the policies and actions. So
Right.
in order to make it into the implementation chapter, it
Right.
needs to be somewhere else first.
Right. So we could put that we could have it as some variation on what Amanda said in the policies, as a policy, and then a few actions. One of those could be like consider revising the ordinance or something like that, and then the nuts and bolts might be worked out in the implementation.
Or to Charles's point, I mean, what Charles said is a policy statement. If you have a really firm policy statement about how you deal with these types of properties, I think that could perhaps resolve some of these issues, at least, because part of what this plan is doing is it's guiding city decision-making. So when this comes up for city resources, capital improvements, what is the policy that we're saying in this plan that we're following as an organization?
I don't know that it necessarily means that you could not pursue something like this separately. I mean, what I'm talking about, because I think this is a major thing, especially with District 65, that that we start to get a handle on this. Because if we wait for this process to unfold and go through the blah, 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 and get watered down, some major things could be lost. I'm just saying that, maybe it's something we should just consider, like, what would it take to amend the ordinance to clarify and to create more of a role to preserve, like, these major, because I think that the city buildings, 65, all those things are kind of out there now.
Question for you, Kate. What is the city is a major landholder, land property owner, right? What percentage of the city is owned, what percentage of the city is owned by the city?
I don't know, but I could get you that
So
information.
1/3 of the city is tax exempt.
So
So
Northwest
That
that includes the hospitals, Northwestern, and both school districts.
Right.
But, that's.
and the city property.
And churches and synagogues and places
but in
of
terms
worship.
but in terms of city-owned property, like, I'm just thinking, the largest property owner in this country is the General Services Administration. It's the federal government. And I am wondering if one of the sort of justifications for us being able to kind of push on this topic that you guys are talking about is the fact that we're actually, it's not like a small thing. It's probably a pretty big percentage of the population.
On this topic, because I sense that for me, sounds like a big deal, that it should be taken out of the context of this meeting, but I think that it's something we need to take up as a separate meeting of the commission rather than try and deal with it in the context of the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, I just wondered if Cade knew off the top of his head. But I do think that it should be in the comprehensive plan.
Yes.
Right? Or not but I'm sensing that we're on the same page. So that would be one of the pieces of feedback. That this would be a policy.
And this, I believe this came up at one of the Land Use Commission meetings too, that typically a comprehensive plan would have what's called like a community systems chapter, and it would include city resources, school district resources, and it would have very specific policy statements about how they work with those partner organizations, what our objectives are, what the population's vision is for these resources. It's not uncommon either for a comprehensive plan. I think the past comprehensive plan or the current one we have now to talk very specifically about how certain resources would be used or repurposed. So it's
Would it
not,
be
I guess
too-
what you're saying is it can be included. It doesn't have to be in a preservation chapter, but it's good feedback that maybe that's a gap in the current plan.
Like, would it be too specific to have a policy or request a policy that says something like, if it's on the landmark studies list and it's a city-owned building, then it has to at least come before the Preservation Commission for advisory?
Well, that is the ordinance currently.
Okay.
That is the existing ordinance does say that.
So I think, Charles, you're asking for something
Not
a little
schools, you're correct, Jack.
Yeah.
And schools are much more complicated because they're dealt with entirely differently, even in their permitting process. The school district does not have to pull a permit to alter those structures. So even though they are landmarks, the way our ordinance works is they do not have to come before this commission. And they haven't in the past. They've replaced windows in certain cases, and they haven't had to come in front of this body. But the comprehensive plan could have policy statements about engaging with them prior to when they do that, and at least explaining what our position is and encouraging them or trying to create persuasive arguments for them to follow.
So
Oh,
I
I'm
think
sorry.
that what, I'm just going to throw this out there. The police and fire department station is on our eligible list as a landmark. And it's in the comprehensive plan of where are we going to put our police and fire department? What's going to happen with that building when it's, so just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I do, this is great feedback. I just don't want to get in the weeds of specific properties when we're talking about it. It's a comprehensive plan right now. I think we've identified that this is certainly a gap that exists in the plan that should be filled.
But not here and there, but actually with us, in this particular case, with a specific policy.
Or an entire chapter that's dedicated to this, yeah.
Because this is way more than a building. What we're talking about here is a very large group of very significant structures.
Yeah. But
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to follow up on, I want to follow up with what Carl said. Maybe at another meeting, we could all adopt a property or something where we work to, get into groups where we adopt a property and then we move it forward to get it. I mean, the way I understand it is anyone can, propose that it become a landmark. I mean, maybe we look at our priorities, and if there's ones that we care deeply about or feel strongly about, we could, like I said, take one and try to move the ball forward to getting it off that list and actually a landmark.
So just as a side note, since you mentioned that, from a procedural perspective, obviously that's not for us to be talking about tonight, but every January, there's a annual work plan discussion, which is whoever the new chair is would run that. And that, Amanda, is where you could propose something like that, I think. And then that would be we would vote on it, and in 2025, this is what we would do. Just like we had some annual work plan stuff for 2024, which we, attempted to address. Does that sound okay? Does anyone have anything else, major issues that you'd like to bring up that you think we should, about the comprehensive plan, that you think we should, and this is not necessarily just the Preservation Commission, Preservation chapter at this point, but anything that you'd like to discuss and make sure we have consensus on that needs to be in our letter. Because we are approaching 9 o'clock. One thing we could do is take a quick break, and then we would come back and talk about zoning code. That feels right to me. But I don't want to cut it off if there's something that somebody else wants to say.
If we're not going to go through the other chapters, I
Yeah.
do have other things to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
I mean, this is our opportunity to talk about the rest of it.
Okay, well, because I think we need to acknowledge, if we're going to talk about economic development, we're going to talk about potentially, new, taller, bigger developments, we need to discuss who is in those buildings currently, and some of them are long-standing legacy businesses, and what is the plan to make sure that they stay here in Evanston? We do have the Evanston Legacy Business Alliance that is in its infancy and is hopefully going to continue to grow, but I think that as we move forward, there maybe needs to be some kind of policy in place that when there is a planned development proposed, that they acknowledge the businesses that are on site, and there's an attempt to either retain them on site or work with the neighborhood to find a new site for them, because I would hate to see planned developments being proposed with this new zoning code and then see the demise of our business districts and cherished businesses.
So that would be, do you have a section or a page number or something that we can look at together?
Well, I mean, it's related to economic development, it's related to preservation, it's related to, so specifically, oh gosh, let's see, I mean.
There was a discussion prompt in economic development that came up. It was a common theme commissioners had, but it's, let me see, should more traditional and human-scaled business districts such as Central Street, Main, Dempster, and Noyes have associated economic development goals that prioritize stabilization of their existing vibrant economic and community environments as a way of taking pressure off historic preservation as the only stabilization tool? Is that what you're somewhat referring to, Carl?
Yes, I'm not able to locate it right.
It's okay. I didn't
right
mean to
now,
put you on
but-
the spot. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to.
But, yeah, I mean, I think it's what people are drawn to, and what drives our economy is that we have unique identities to small business districts, and that those districts, a lot of the character are the businesses, and some of those businesses have characteristic signs or features on their buildings that add to the identity of the community. I mean, it's just like if the neon sign was removed on Benison's, most people would notice and go, what is going on here? Are we going to have a 15-story tower there? Or, things like that. I mean, so I think there should be some kind of process in the plan development that they start acknowledge that.
I certainly think that some more emphasis on legacy businesses and that kind of stuff could absolutely be incorporated into the comprehensive plan, for sure. And then when it's discussed in the zoning code, there's a basis for it. Does everyone agree that that should be incorporated? Okay, so we have consensus on that. Did you have something else?
I mean, I'm going to go through chapter by chapter if you don't want to, if we're not going to do that and just go to zoning.
Well, Kate, we did say that we were going to go chapter by chapter. Do you have other stuff you wanted to prompt us with? I mean, we have a few minutes before 9.
Depends, I can pick if there's specific chapters we would like to jump to in the interest of time. We could jump to those, but yes, there are discussion prompts for each chapter. We spend a lot of time on preservation and rightfully so.
I mean, I think the placemaking one is, might be, that's preservation adjacent, right? So, do you have stuff for that one?
I have very few for that, surprisingly, but is there a specific chapter that others are interested? It seems like some of the discussion that I heard, bigger picture discussion points are maybe related to housing goals or land use goals, and if those are chapters that we want to jump to.
Chair Driller, I think it was land use 1.1 is where
Okay.
I wrote notes on the
Sure.
legacy business. So that was, oh gosh, sorry, flipping back and forth. It says to direct development to centers and corridors to ensure the efficient use of land use and access to transportation choices and amenities. And 1.1 is to update zoning regulations to increase the housing supply and allow more people to live, work, and operate businesses in centers and corridors. So it's because of the businesses, I guess I put that. And then land use 1.4, develop policies to attract, support, and retain local businesses as development and redevelopment occurs. So those two, I think, were what I had related to legacy businesses.
Yeah, that could
To
definitely
make
be.
stronger reference to legacy
Right.
businesses within
Yeah.
those. That's good feedback. Do you want me?
No, I was going to encourage you to
Oh,
keep
sure.
going.
One that I think we talked about that I think is important, and you brought it up, Carl, centers and corridors. This was a discussion prompt that I think everyone that I talked to and received comments from brought up. But although the centers and corridors framework for the plan's land use section is seemingly non-divergent from Evanston's existing pattern of development, does a proposed reduction in complexity of land use categories in subsequent zoning districts represent the rich uniqueness of neighborhoods that make Evanston desirable and unique in the region? Should the proposed land use map or a new map or the text in the planning context section identify and expand on the rich diversity, complexity, and uniqueness and identity of various geographic areas of the city? And should that translate into a more complex and prescriptive land use approach in zoning code than what's proposed?
I think I said it earlier in our conversation, but I think this goes back to what I was saying of potential multi-listing district in the downtown and using that as an incentive for our downtown to revitalize it. Having a property listed as a landmark and on the National Register opens people up to financing so that we could potentially see rehabilitation and reuse of the existing building stock instead of new buildings in their place.
Other comments in response to this prompt?
A quick comment. I know we just redid our application, but does our application anywhere say, or maybe in the future, it could say like, have you explored, options with SHPO or whatever, some prompt on the actual application? You're talking about incentives. I don't know that homeowners know about that, the tax freeze specifically. I didn't know actually until I was sitting on this panel at one meeting, and I was like, really? I qualify for that. So I'm not sure. I like that idea, Carl, to have that sort of more forward-facing for folks.
We have in Preserve 2040, we have a whole education and advocacy sort of component, and that was part of it, to try to create a conversation around that and make sure that people understand what is available for them.
It's not on the app, the permit, or the preserve, any of those, maybe, I don't know, I just think maybe one day, and I didn't give this feedback, I didn't think about it, but maybe we could put it on there, like,
Or on
you
the-
may
on the
qualify, have
website.
you, somewhere, so people, if they're filling it out, are like, or their contractor might bring it to their attention or something.
It's definitely something we could consider. I wanted to note the Centers and Corridors framework. On page 14, chapter 1, it says, the plan outlines a land use strategy that focuses development in mixed-use centers and corridors. It also uses historic preservation as a land use tool to maintain architectural diversity and celebrate cultural heritage. And then it goes on and talks about centers and corridors again. So it actually does claim to use historic preservation as a land use tool, but I don't see how. And so it seems to me that needs to be developed.
I think it's probably speaking to surveying, registering buildings that are significant and supporting, and there is language in the preservation chapter about supporting nominations for those types of buildings. But I think that's the framework.
But it suggests that there's some connection between the centers and corridors, like approach, and historic preservation as a land use tool, that there's supposed to be some conversation going on, and it is not here.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the very first thing we talked about cross-referencing
Well, and maybe
some
we,
of these policy statements.
maybe we cite studies that have already been done, like the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm going to butcher the title. It was like Older, Smaller, Better was the study that showed that people are drawn to buildings that are older and they're more human scaled, and they tracked cell phone data to find that that's where people are going to eat and shop. And so I think in that study there were some potential land use implementation. So I'm sure that if we reference that study, we, like Charles said, we don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. We can go out and find these studies and other things that other cities have done and reference them and use them in our plan.
And I think this also goes back to Stuart's point, is that it doesn't just have to be on the back of preservation and a preservation ordinance, that one of the primary functions of zoning is to restrict development potential, and that zoning can be a companion tool to preservation efforts or stabilization efforts.
One thing that came to mind when Carl was speaking just a second ago, and this actually is related directly to economics as well as heritage tourism, which we talk about in Preserve 2040 as well. And I don't know that there is very much heritage tourism like organized. There is heritage tourism here, but it's not. I don't know what is organized about it. I think there's aspirational organization. Like there's
So you're saying we're not Oak Park that has Frank Lloyd Wright, and
Right.
everyone knows Oak Park Frank Lloyd Wright. Like, it's not to the point of Evanston Daniel Burnham or, you know.
there's a lot of opportunity in Evanston for heritage tourism that isn't being exploited or taken advantage of. And so in any case, there's and so that's economics and preservation and placemaking. Like it sort of, so if you all agree that heritage tourism is something that we could be a little bit more forward about, then,
I mean,
in various
we do
places.
have several national historic landmarks in our
Yeah,
city.
we have, it's like
so-
individual, but there's,
Right, but there's the Lighthouse, there's the Francis Willard, and there's the Dawes House, and then there's all of our historic houses that the History Center has walking tours through. But you're right, there's not really a cohesive,
cohesive is
like
what I'm saying.
Evanston tourism effort.
Right.
Yes.
It's, I mean, I actually think goes to placemaking too. It's just, an identity of Evanston. And like, if you wanted to visit Evanston, what website would you go to see all your options? There's lots of,
Well, I think there is a city effort of that Enjoy Evanston,
Yeah.
I think, which is a relatively new thing. If you go on to enjoyevanston.com.org, it shows the business. It's more for shopping, I guess, but there could be a heritage
There could
tourism
be.
aspect to that. Yes.
there's lots of opportunities, is what I'm saying. And so heritage tourism was my entry into preservation when I was a young person in college. So for me, this is a big thing, and it's in Preserve 2040. And it checks a lot of the boxes here that this plan says it wants to cover. So, yeah, it's definitely there, but it could have a little bit more of a presence. Okay, we are at 9:00. We don't have to stop talking about the comprehensive plan now. It's just that it's 9:00 and we usually take a break. So we could take a break now, or we could keep finishing this and then take a break. What do you guys want to do?
I thought the comprehensive plan zoning break made sense.
Okay.
Carl, it sounded like you had a few other things to talk about.
It did.
So I just have a few more. And they're quick. Chapter 3 for transportation. There's the Purple Line modernization project that may be happening in the next 20 years. And whenever the CTA gets funding to do that, and there are eligible properties, stations along there, South Street, South Boulevard, Main Street, Central Street, and transportation section talks about making sure that those stations are accessible and with elevators and whatnot, but just they're at the infancy stage. They haven't gotten to the point of design yet, but those historic stations, I think, should be addressed and looked at and seen how they can be rehabilitated, because they do add a lot to the history of transportation and how the city has developed over time.
Yeah, and this is something that I heard from multiple members too. Should the historic associations and architectural significance of the city's train stations, the Central L, South Boulevard L, Davis, Main, and Central Metro stations be prioritized and balanced with development goals for these resources that increase accessibility and function? So I think I'm hearing that the answer is yes.
They aren't landmarked right now, right?
No, not.
I think Central Street is.
Central Street is not.
Oh, it's not?
Main
Okay.
is not. I think the only landmarks are South Boulevard, the L station, and the Central Street L
But
station. And they have a pretty ornate terracotta detailing.
Yeah, so this is an example of the potential discontiguous district, or there's another type of thing which I have also written in the past in my consulting years, which is linear. So that's for transportation, typically for transportation or like waterways and stuff, which could also be used for this particular purpose. But in any case, certainly that could be mentioned a little bit more in this comprehensive plan, some variation on that.
Well, because there's there's discussion about ownership of the right-of-way and what's going to happen.
Right.
We may not have a Purple Line if Union Pacific and CTA can't come to agreement.
But that's the reason why the linear resource type exists, because it takes into consideration the fact that the industrial fabric that connects the stations is also potentially historic, with the viaducts and all that stuff. Anyway.
I think this connects to, and Commissioner Johnson couldn't be here, but he thought that should there be mention in the transportation section about the L and the Metro and their importance to Evanston's soundscape, particularly the rumble of the L through neighborhoods, which is, I think, really unique to Evanston as a suburb of Chicago.
I'll just continue. So Chapter 4, Parks and Open Space. I have the Lakeshore Historic District Resource Inventory states, from the first plat of Evanston platted by Phil O. Judson in 1854, parks have played a significant role in the overall character of the city of Evanston. And I think that the comprehensive plan should have something about the fact that we have significant objects and structures in our parks. Some of them are currently designated as landmarks, including the Centennial Fountain in Merrick Rose Garden, the Flagpole Monument at Patriots Park, the Yerkes Fountain and Horse Trough, and potentially there could be a survey to identify other historic features and objects and structures in those parks, because the comprehensive plan does talk about a maintenance plan and identifying how to bring all of our parks up to current standards. And I would like them in that process to address if there are any resources.
I think this was another one that came up pretty frequently. The prompt was, should the Parks and Open Space chapter include policy statements that speak to the historic associations and cultural significance of parks and open spaces in Evanston, especially those within historic districts, and should that cultural significance inform future planning, use, and design decisions for those parks?
Well, yes. So, you know, the interesting thing about parks, particularly in Evanston, just about all the parks were donated to Evanston. Mason Park was the first park in Evanston that was designated as a city park, and it was donated by a family. Parks and schools are very interesting because nearly all of them have names of people. They're named for people. So there's a strong historic connection, and with those. The history of Ladd Arboretum is really incredible, how it came into existence and how it's developed, for instance. Yes, parks are significant historical elements of the community for so many reasons. But they, in many cases, parks, green space, protect historic buildings. They're surrounded by landscape as opposed to not being surrounded by landscape. I guess the question was, do they deserve special attention? Do open spaces preserve special attention? I think, again, this goes back to the ability of an individual to appreciate their surroundings. There are a lot of views and vistas that maybe I'm more sensitive to because that's what I'm interested in, but that should be celebrated. Just as of course the one that's most iconic is the lighthouse. And would you want to have a 37-story building blocking the view of the lighthouse? But anyway, that needs to be identified as something of interest and something to work with.
One of the things that I noticed in this chapter, I'm on page 61, the policies and actions for this chapter, they're almost all about inclusive, equitable accessibility, which is actually great. But I don't see, just looking at it now, I mean, is there anything here about the historic and cultural value of parks? So maybe just to try to zone in on some actual feedback that we could put in our letter, would we say that there needs to be some more policies added? Like this at least needs to be, this is the policy level, like in bold print.
I think
out the
just
story.
a basic survey would be helpful while they're developing the maintenance plan for parks.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of this that could be one
statement.
policy statement here. Like there's 4. I mean, there's lots of white space on the page. We could fill that in with some, at least one more policy and then some actions. One of which is the survey and stuff. That seems to be an omission in this chapter, which is.
I think it's just the reference to the aesthetic experience of those things. Kate has done a fantastic job of writing creating that kind of that kind of writing, for instance. He's a landscape architect. But it's more, see, it's not like bricks and mortar are a lot easier to talk about for most people, but to talk about the quality of the experience of a landscape and how it's preserved is only something that, if Frederick Laws Olmsted or Jens Jensen or whatever, in their writings, you would pick that up. So the thing is just like you said, how do you verbalize that in a way that fits in this kind of a plan? And I think while it may be somewhat of a struggle, I think it's very important. And when it's done, it amounts to poetry. but it's very important to be able to communicate the value of that.
So there are policies, but it's that I'm familiar with, they call historic urban landscape, but that's for like World Heritage sites. How do we take it down from World Heritage to to like a cultural landscape of the experience of parks and the walking up and down a street with our trees, and I guess that would be
I can answer real quick. You can. The experience of Versailles is exactly the same as the experience of Lat Arboretum for the individual at the time.
There are, the National Park Service through the Technical Assistance Bureau, I think they have somewhat recently put out some guidelines for cultural landscapes more broadly than what you're talking about, like a World Heritage.
Because I think that the concept of a cultural landscape is what connects the two of the built and natural world, and they're not separate, they're together. And to understand,
can't be disconnected
to
from each
understand the context of what Evanston is with our tree-lined residential streets, or most people in the city are within a 10-minute walking of a park or something like that. That's our cultural landscape, and that's what kind of generates the identity of who we are as a community.
So I do think that sounds like we definitely have consensus on that, and we could certainly create a policy or two about that and some action items, and I think that could end up being looked upon very favorably.
And I think in the same vein, and this also came from Commissioner Johnson, but he asked or posed the question, should trees and landscapes be further discussed in terms of not only their environmental but historic and cultural associations? Many individual trees are part of the historic and cultural landscape fabric of the community. Should sustainability and protection of setting and landscape features be identified as a significant issue to retaining Evanston's sense of place and community character? So I think what I'm hearing is the answer is yes.
Yeah, we have stuff in the Preserve 2040 about that too.
Yeah, I like that, because there are concepts of like a witness tree, or trees that have been around for significant events, or trees that have been significant for other demographics, like there's the trees that have been trail markers and other things, so I like that.
Anyway, I do think that we should just, acknowledge that they have done something here in this comprehensive plan with, emphasizing inclusion and accessibility and equity, which does actually reflect Evanston. Whether they've done a good job of it or not is for others to decide. But, I don't think that precludes us from adding some policies there. Were there other items? Okay.
I was going to say, with regard to that, we do have the tree preservation ordinance.
Yep.
So, that's for trees and.
But it could be mentioned here in
Yes.
the comprehensive plan. Remind everybody that it's there. Other thoughts and stuff about the comprehensive plan? Because if not, we'll take I'm sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Both the housing and the land use doesn't mention preservation at all. I think it's a huge hole.
I think you're right. With housing, we could potentially bring up the idea of vernacular housing and the houses that are on lots that could potentially be susceptible to development pressure.
Right.
I did have quite a few on housing. There was quite a bit of consensus with the feedback I got from the commission, but should the housing chapter include additional reference to the already existing diversity of housing types, choice in architectural forms and styles throughout the city? Should the relationship between existing and needed urban, missing middle, and single-family housing be supported by additional metrics, data analysis, and housing mix goals that support and guide decision-making? And there's also some more complex questions here as well, but I think that you're right, that there's kind of a hole that at least you identified, that it's also about retention and maybe celebration of housing mix and housing diversity. I think that's something I heard from the commission, that they think Evanston is really celebrated in the past and is known for within the region.
Do we have anybody that disagrees with that? Because that's another way to gauge consensus.
I think that would be a goal, to have some kind of, if we're talking about goals or long-range plan, to have some kind of incentive to help homeowners maintain their homes, with with windows or just basic maintenance.
Yeah, I think that we mentioned that in 2040 as well. So hopefully that stuff will get incorporated into the comprehensive.
I think that's something that's happening right as we speak. There's a, maybe other know more about it than I do, certainly, but a program in the Fifth Ward, for instance, to help homeowners to maintain their property. I think it's part of the it's part of the energy conservation plan, and so that's in that, to maintain those properties for the purpose of increasing efficiency, a home efficiency plan. That's what it is. But are we talking more about the outside aesthetics, the appearance, or what?
Just helping people afford to maintain an older home. Right.
Right. Well, that's the intention. It's because it is needs-based.
Does anyone disagree? Because if not, we could add that to the letter and work out the details. It's, when we see how the rest of the comprehensive plan is evolving. This one seems to me, going back to the beginning of our conversation a few hours ago, and at this point, of like having more connectivity between chapters, more cross-referencing and stuff. Heritage tourism is a very interdisciplinary thing, and then this one could be too. And there was also a question about how does historic preservation and affordability how do historic preservation and affordability go together? These are opportunities to highlight that, because it seems to us relatively clear, but maybe it's not to others.
So maybe we need to add something that I know that there have been studies done by, like, Place Economics has done a study on the fact that when a historic, like, take a historic vintage 3-flat, and that's torn down, and sometimes there's a 6-flat put in its place, the affordability of that property is gone. That when you take a historic resource and you replace it with a new resource, that new resource will never be able to be at the level of affordability that the historic resource was at.
And one of the things that has saved some resources is the fact that there's no money to replace them. That's a story of the Main Street America for a lot all over the country. Okay, I'm not trying to rush anybody, but I'm just trying to gauge, like, how are we feeling about the conversation we've had about the comprehensive plan? Do we feel that we've come up with enough stuff to say to the Land Use Commission and the mayor and city council, and we can move on to zoning?
There was one that I'd like to just because I've heard it come up, and I'd like to understand if there's consensus here, but the first is, does the commission believe that single-family neighborhoods are important aspects of Evanston's community character and pattern of development? Many other older neighborhoods, especially the Lakeshore and Northeast Historic District, currently contain a rich diversity of housing densities and choice. This is something that came up a lot at the Land Use Commission, and I think that it might be a nice opportunity to weigh in. And then in that same vein, to what Charles was talking about earlier, but does the commission also believe that there are portions of the housing chapter and its associated zoning recommendations that may inadvertently increase displacement pressures and potential for neighborhood deterioration? Specifically, something that came up when I talked to several commissioners was the idea, and Stuart brought it up earlier, of you're inserting a profit motive for potential demolition of smaller scale, more vernacular and attainable housing types that already exist throughout the city.
So is this a conversation for zoning code or for the comprehensive plan?
Sometimes it's hard to disconnect the two since the
Yeah.
zoning is the implementation tool. But I think that since the policies and actions in the comprehensive plan inform what the zoning tries to implement, I think first these are probably comprehensive plan decisions, and then specifics about recommendations within the zoning code can come after.
So this feels like a big question. Yeah. So, it's kind of what I assumed we were going to talk about first with R1 and zoning code. So how do you guys feel about taking a break and coming back and talking about this? And then it would provide kind of a transition from the comprehensive plan to the R1. Does that sound like a good plan to everybody? Usually we only take 5 minutes, do you guys? But we've been sitting here for a little longer than we normally do. Do you want a little extra time? Or do you want to just take 5 and come back? 5 is okay? Okay, so we'll take 5, and we'll come back, according to my thing is 9:27. Okay, we're going to come back and talk about the next piece of this, which is the zoning code, and also the question that Cade put to us, which is going to give us sort of a bridge from the comprehensive plan to the zoning code. Do you have a brief summary of the question that you asked before we took our break?
I think I don't know if I do. The first was, does the commission believe that single-family neighborhoods are important aspects of Evanston's community character and pattern of development? And then also just as kind of a counterpoint to that many of the older neighborhoods, including the Lakeshore Historic District and Northeast Historic District, contain a rich diversity of housing choice and densities currently. And then the second companion piece to this was, does the commission believe there are portions of this chapter and its associated zoning recommendations that may inadvertently increase displacement pressures and potential for neighborhood deterioration? And that spoke to what Stuart was talking about inserting development opportunity or profit motive, potentially for demolition of smaller scale, more vernacular and attainable housing types.
Does anyone want to weigh in, start us off?
The housing issue in Evanston is like, the third rail kind of thing, especially, well, at least in parts of town. When we talk about trying to preserve neighborhoods, there are a lot of neighborhoods that for many reasons, shouldn't be preserved. Is this like a kind of an academic thing we're talking? Are you wanted to preserve specific areas of neighborhoods that are representative of a larger a community, or are you, which would seem to be more of a preservation goal and the kind of thing that we're interested in, or are we trying to preserve 2 blocks of something? I don't understand when you talk about the neighborhood what that really means.
Well, I think that depends. So there's another kind of companion question here about, do you think the portions of the preservation chapter could mitigate some of these concerns? So that could speak to nominating and designating certain neighborhoods that are higher in artistic value, or maybe through the conservation district approach, locations of more affordability that exists, those types of strategies. Do you think that mitigates that? Or one of the commission's purpose statements talks about neighborhood stabilization generally. So do you think some of these might destabilize neighborhoods? Does that answer your question?
Do you have your?
Yes, yes, that provides some of the answer. But I'm just still, I've lived in Evanston for a long time. I've seen very little change happen at Church and Dodge over all the decades that I've lived here. And I have been involved in the community in many different ways. There are some interesting, the Robinson family, for instance, has a tremendous history there, and some of that space can be attributed to Sonny Robinson's family and all the stuff that they did, for instance. And there are other families, the Summers family, for instance, and where they lived and all that. But when I was, again, this is a tough issue, but it's something that's like a conversation with Dino Robinson and the historical Evanston Historical Society and other things to kind of like be able to focus in and have more of a kind of picture of what that is, because I'm having a hard time with this. And one thing is because I care so much about that population and and the situation and the struggle that they're in there. And like I said, there's potential to do harm, there's potential to do good, but it's kind of hard to figure. I haven't been able to figure it out. So that's where I'm coming from.
I think the other thing that's really important is that a comprehensive plan, these zoning considerations, there's multiple influences, right? So preservation is, a neighborhood stabilization is one of those. And is there maybe a way that those two goals can be better balanced so that you're increasing housing production, you're increasing the opportunity for that, but maybe those interventions are somehow more compatible or to scale, or they decrease this kind of profit motive that Stuart brought up, or these development pressures that have come up as concerns.
So I think that potentially limiting in a certain area a percentage of, like multifamily may help, because I live in southeast Evanston, where historically they were single-family homes, and then in the 20s it became all vintage apartment buildings, and overnight that neighborhood completely changed character. It's a really dense neighborhood now with all apartment buildings that was single-family homes. I used to live in the Melwood Apartments on Michigan and Hamilton, and that was kind of like an eye-opener for Evanstonians in the early 20th century, because it was this huge 3-story, 27-unit apartment building plopped into a single-family, neighborhood. And so potentially maybe setting a limit or a certain percentage of a neighborhood would help that idea, but then not cast the neighborhood in amber, so it's not like it's frozen and it will always be that way. It will allow for development over time, but mitigating, is that, I don't know.
Well, I think the thing that we should start with is, design addresses a need. And so it's in the atmosphere. Governor Pritzker was just talking about it today, that there needs to be more housing. And so, okay, what do? Let's just multiply by 4. I think we should start with what is the problem. So I did a little math from the comprehensive plan. And using that demographic data, if we were at 77,800 individuals last year, they anticipate this plan, I'm not sure where they got the data, that we will be 84,175 by 2045. And they said that here in Evanston, there's about 2.27 people per dwelling. So if you do the math, that's 140 new units a year. That's not that much. So, to me, if those are their numbers, they're saying, that's the design brief. Now let's come up with a solution for that. We should be solving for 140 units a year.
Do we need to downzone or upzone everything in the whole city in order to achieve
Well,
140
did anybody
units?
just look at the math and say, how many? I started looking at that map that I look at all the time on the city's website. God, how many lots are there in the city? how many lots would you have to change? What percentage of this city would you have to change to accomplish 140 units? Why is that not the basis of this?
No, you bring up a very good point. Because that then lowers the scare factor for a lot of people then, because a lot of people are, but I think what it leads to though is, you buy a building, a house or whatever, and you don't know currently like what could go next to you. I mean, it's like in Wilmette. I'm going to throw out an example like Wilmette. You don't know what's going to come next to you. You know, if someone's going to come and buy a house that, you know, the 3-story house and tear it down and put up a McMansion.
Well,
So,
in Evanston, since 2020, we've had ADUs. And I just watched, I don't know if anybody else was on the webinar, NACP, National Conservation, about ADUs in historic districts.
That was today.
That was today, yes.
Yeah, so it's if you didn't see it today, you can
But
stream it
what
again.
I was going to say is, ADUs are useless, completely useless as a tool for increasing housing if you don't limit short-term rental. It's just a way for people to make more money from their property, and it has zero impact on making more affordable housing. So if that's the goal, like, I don't know how many ADUs, and I think this maybe came up with a project that we had before us, but like, if the goal is housing diversity, people are already okay with ADUs, maybe not everybody, but it's something that the city seems to be embracing. Just make that a more effective tool. How many does that get us a year? Not 140 a year, but at least you're doing something that is zero scary, because people are, well, 99% not scary.
well, no, I think that's what Stuart Cohen was saying, is that having some kind of visual guide would help people, because when they hear 4 units per parcel, they're thinking them all stacked up on top of each other instead of maybe 2 in the, somehow spread out over the lot.
But I guess I want to emphasize that we should not start playing the game that has been put before us. We should, like, instead of maybe 4 units are okay. Why are we even talking about 4 units? Like, let's solve a problem. We're designers. And I just don't see anything in here that indicates that it's solving a problem. It's a knee-jerk reaction to what we all realize is a national problem that evidently we feel like we just need to, like, solve it for the whole country here, which is very Evanston and very admirable, but not great problem solving.
And I can try to get you the answer because I don't know the answer. That 84,000 number, what I don't know is if that is a CMAP projection under our existing zoning controls and what they anticipate the population growing to. I don't know when I don't see that as maybe the goal. I don't know if the plan says that.
Well,
it just says that's a projection.
It was a projection, and so I ran with that, but I was also looking at just like, we're closing schools, folks. So is that because there are less kids to go to school? Because if that's the case, we got to frame the problem differently, because we're not running out of housing.
Right.
It might not be affordable, but I don't know that building more of it is the answer.
Well, Commissioner Lindwald, I think, brought this up at the Land Use Commission, is that there's a fine line of setting your zoning maximum at a certain level, because once you set that, you're never going back down. And so the thing is that you want to make sure that you set it high enough to allow for growth, but something that's not too much that we're overbuilding, and
So
becoming super dense.
I think that this is a very good point, because I don't see a lot of reference to demographic projections in terms of this family size. Did you see it in there?
They're in there, but.
So, but the fact that, that they're closing schools is a telling thing. But the problem is that for these new houses, particularly 4 or more unit, the space for those seems to be in the Fifth Ward. I mean, that's the open space. So it's not like that 140 is spread all over town. I think there are pockets where it's more likely to occur. But then if you're talking about a 20-year plan over 20 years, that's almost 3,000 units. If it's 140 a year, and that's the number, then 10 years, it's 1,400, and 20 years is 20, and that's if the 14, if that's 140 doesn't change. Which is why this is a troubling thing to me, that the existence of the transfer station in the Fifth Ward has this impact. So I guess I'm just very, very frustrated trying to think the whole thing through. Another thing that's very interesting is that for me, I don't know if this is relevant or important at all, but there's this whole area over between Oakton and Dempster or somewhere. There's some spaces back there where I think that some of that land was not really very good for development or buildable because there's a lot of pollution, soil pollution that would have to be remediated. Right. So it might be a place where you would do two-story buildings with housing that didn't require a foundation, or one story. So you don't have to dig into those areas. I don't know. That's just kind of thinking about other places where it's very complicated. But the other thing is interesting about that, well, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but the minority, particularly the black population, has really declined in Evanston as a percentage of the overall population. I don't know where that is in the thinking about this. Is that, are people thinking that that's a problem that is just kind of going to melt away because that population is going to be as large? It's complicated, very complicated. Which is why I'm on the Preservation Commission and wouldn't have to think about that. But anyway.
Yeah,
There do have to be guardrails, I think, to prevent displacement. Because, like you said, I mean, certain areas of the city are more ripe for development because of, I mean, we have high cost of land in the city, but certain areas of the city do have land and a house or a building that you could get for lower value than in the on the west side of town. And so how do we address that? How do we keep the displacement from happening?
yeah, I think it would be destabilizing for some areas. I mean, for the reason you're saying, land is cheaper in certain areas. That's where developers will be. There was someone that spoke. There was a developer who spoke at land use, who said that puts developers in competition with homeowners when they're buying a house. And developers are willing to pay more because they're going to put 4 units on it versus a homeowner. So you're going to see some of these they're not historic district, they're not a conservation district, possibly go to developers, big developers. And the Fifth Ward is getting a new school, Foster School. It's I think, going to increasingly destabilize and gentrify that area. And I don't think it's going to provide affordable housing. I don't know how we define affordable housing, but I don't think those properties are be particularly affordable once the developers are done, given that construction costs are nowhere near, land is still relatively expensive, and then construction costs are very expensive. So I personally would need to see some data that would support that affordable housing. I think you have to be more intentional with affordable housing, and I don't think this is very intentional. It's like throwing it out to capitalism, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be the outcome people are saying it's going to be with affordability.
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of luxury condos in the Fifth Ward. Who does that help exactly?
So to bring it back to our sort of mission here tonight in terms of feedback for the mayor and city council and land use commission, it sounds to me that we might have some consensus here that we could articulate, right? that has to do with sort of questioning whether the way in which they're going about this with multifamily, four units, is actually going to achieve, like, what is the goal, and is the way in which they're achieving this goal actually going to achieve the goal?
Well, and I think we have an example that we could already cite on Grant. I think it's on Grant, that was those tiny houses, or whatever, they're about 1,000 square feet,
Yeah,
that
they're
are
on Grant.
currently selling for $375,000 a piece. So, and they're like, what, maybe 4 to 6 on the lot? So,
And it's smaller. I think it's like 350 square feet or something like
They're
that.
incredibly tiny, and I think there's
they're
like
tinier than.
11 of them.
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the
yeah.
lot.
They're really tiny.
No, I thought that there were 6. And, 375 is actually affordable in that neighborhood. But for 350 square feet, that's,
Although not
Question
really that
for
long ago, I
whom?
almost bought a property to develop on Grant Street. It was like, a bungalow. It was like 1.5-story bungalow that was $275,000 in like 2022. So, I mean, there are houses in lots of neighborhoods that are inexpensive. I'm granted a developer bought that house that I was going to buy and then put a nasty, terrible addition on it and then sold it for like $800,000. But it wasn't in a historic district, so it couldn't be saved.
one thing that, in the Fifth Ward especially, if they're interested still, and we had the capacity for it, for conservation districts could help with some of this. So then we go back to the conversation we're having about the comprehensive plan, which is why we needed to have that early on. But in terms of our feedback on this, we could continue talking about it, or we could say we have consensus on a couple of these big things and agree to put that in the letter, and then, do you guys?
I just want to say, I think, Tom, I like the way you came at it with, like, quantifying it, because I also think that, like, changing the zoning code and making 4 units like a right on all these properties across the city is just too, it's not necessary to achieve the goal of more housing, and I don't think it needs to happen. And to answer the question Kate asked, I do think there's value in these single-family neighborhoods. And that was the question. So I don't agree with, like, having that as a right in a lot of places. And to your point, Sarah, we can only but influence the preservation districts. We can't do that for the 90%, the other 90%. So I do think the city should focus on maybe the zoning of 4 units on, they talk about centers and corridors. Like, I think there's certain areas where it really makes sense, but some of these neighborhoods I don't think are the place.
We are tasked with being concerned about neighborhood stabilization, though, right? And which is
Correct.
not, in other words, when I mentioned the 10%, 90%, that's in terms of who comes before us that we have binding design review over. But we have, as part of our ordinance, neighborhood stabilization, the mission to be concerned about that. So that's how we can justify this part of the conversation here. But beyond the conservation districts and the other stuff we've already talked about. But do we have consensus on that part of it?
There's one
Okay,
thing
go
that
ahead.
I think is important to circle back on, is Tom, your point, I think, is really important in what is the ultimate goal, and maybe setting that goal first and working back from it. And I think that the math is, even more complicated because, and this was shared with me recently, and I can look at it, but, of those, properties that they say are being upzoned to allow for up to 4 units, it looks like the data now is about only 42% of those parcels meet the lot size requirements to do that. So only, a subset of what they're saying can even achieve that. And they did map it. It's interesting. I can look at it.
So I know the land use is currently exploring changing the lot size to bring into conformity a bunch of, is that what this is doing?
That's
Or-
what this, exactly. I would have loved to have seen this map, because I was wondering the same thing.
Yeah, and it's, so everything, and they're saying that these are controllable separately. So everything that's red is showing properties that are substandard in lot size, so it couldn't support the 4 units without seeking some kind of special entitlement to do so.
Right.
Everything in blue represents the historic designations. So in order to do that, there's some additional layer of coming in front of this commission to do that. So I think it's just a really important point that the math, even beyond setting a goal, is maybe a little more complicated just by the lot sizes that we have that can achieve this goal.
On your map, what's the pink? Because that's looking like the area, the pink.
So
Purple, excuse me.
pink are properties that are zoned R2, so it has a smaller minimum lot size
So
requirement,
are
I
those,
think.
but are those the lots, those pink lots?
Those are substandard.
So those would not be
Correct. They do not
eligible
meet the-
for,
Correct. Yeah,
Well, without zoning relief, which, you know,
correct.
it frequently,
Yeah, so they would
zoning
have to-
frequently passes zoning relief
Right, but it-
on stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, I'm just saying that's, yes, that's true, but it could still happen, yeah.
in any case, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying the math is complicated even in that respect, and maybe even, before Stuart left, his major points on this were having it be a little more fine grain and there be a finer texture to it. Maybe this comes into the equation about areas that are zoned a certain way and areas that are not, if there's concentrations like you're seeing here that can't support that. And then his other point, which we talked about earlier, which I think couples with this, is that whatever the introduction is, whether it's 2, 3, 4, whatever the unit is, that it's to scale and that it's compatible and that idea is somehow communicated. And we talked about design guidelines,
But if you buy 2 of those red dots, what happens then?
yeah. So there is the opportunity to consolidate parcels, subdivisions and consolidations. That's a city council decision.
So there should be probably a moratorium on lot, lot
Consolidation.
consolidation and deconversion of multi-unit buildings to single-family homes. The other thing you were talking about, scale, potentially maybe a way of doing it that would then be so that it could be a formula so that it would be compatible to what street it's on, is potentially using the width of the street and a kind of a proportion so that you use the width of the street to the height of the buildings on either side. So that way you're not saying that everything needs to be 35 feet or whatever. In that way, because some streets are more narrow than others, and like Park Place is one of the widest streets in the city, and that's going to be completely different than, a street, Colfax or whatever, that's closer together.
So it sounds like there's a lot of consensus on like the reality that like there's nuance to this, and we want that nuance to be communicated to Envision 2045. I mean, is that what I mean? Can we
Yeah.
have like a list of all the reasons just as an examples? Like, hey, this is a plan. Like, let's be more nuanced about this than some sort of blanket upzoning. And here are just a handful of examples.
Yeah, so what I was trying to get to earlier was, the like basis for the Preservation Commission talking about this is through this mandate of neighborhood stabilization. So do we have consensus on that part? Yes. Also?
That part meaning that the proposed zoning would not support stabilization of neighborhoods.
And
There were
unintended
too many
consequences,
negatives of that.
perhaps.
Is that what you just said?
I just would, if you could sum up what we're agreeing to.
Well, that this, well, first of all, it sounds like we do have consensus that this discussion does fall within our mandate of neighborhood stabilization, right? So that we are justified in talking about it within the context of Historic Preservation Commission. But I guess the question that I have for you all is, what do we see as neighborhood stabilization? Like, what does that actually, what are we thinking about when we say that? Like, what is the thing we are trying to stabilize? Single-family homes, is that the thing?
I think we're trying to what we're talking about, neighborhood stabilization, it's not in the use of the property, but more of the visual compatibility of scale, massing, what our standards, what we look at, right?
So in that case, though, just to play devil's advocate, if somebody were to build or design a four-flat in some way that was compatible with its neighbors, that would be okay? That would not destabilize the neighborhood?
So I think going back to our conversation about, my comment about, luxury condos in
Yeah.
the Fifth Ward, like if part of the goal here, and even though, I guess having affordable housing is part of that's partly neighborhood stabilization, and like to take away, to harm the goal of affordable housing in the name of affordable housing is, I guess, what we're possibly talking about. That if we upzone, we don't know the unintended consequences of it. Depends on the neighborhood. I mean, it might lower property values in parts of Southeast Evanston or parts of Northwest Evanston. It might, raise property values in other areas that would actually deplete affordable housing. So there's a stabilization component to that, but it needs to be more nuanced than a blanket R4 up.
For sure.
I thi-
But if I may just respond to Josh really quick. The thing about, like, property values is that is not our expertise on this commission. So what I am trying to make sure is that when we say what we're saying, that we're saying it we're framing it within preservation. Like, I totally see that there is consensus, but I'm not,
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Well, I think-
we're not there.
Stabilization means who can live in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly
Is that,
what-
that's a pretty reasonable definition.
That's not, though, the way Carla was saying.
That's not
I think
inside
it's
of our
who can
purview.
stay in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right, who can stay in the
Yeah,
neighborhood.
that's how I thought about it as
I
well.
think that's right.
Yeah.
I would look at it that way. I think it's also just important, and I've said it before, there are these housing goals, there are housing production goals, that is an influence, there are preservation, neighborhood stabilization goals, that is an influence. If 4 units is seen as a destabilization, stabilization force, said this so many times, is there something that's more compatible, that minimizes the ability to destabilize a neighborhood while still achieving some degree of increased housing production?
Well, I think it's nuanced. Like it depends on the neighborhood, it depends on the area, and it requires some sort of mechanism for adjudicating that rather than just a blanket. Like we're talking about destabilizing something with just like a really large blanket change. I mean, I don't see how that couldn't be inside of our purview. Like we're just asking for nuance, and I think there are reasons.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear in our heads, but we just need to figure out how to articulate it so that we're not saying something to city council and the mayor.
That's outside of our purview.
Right, because that will undermine our credibility.
I don't know that it is clear in our heads. I mean, we have, I don't know it's intellectually or visually how that would mean to be clear in our heads. I think that there are a lot of carrots and a lot of sticks to apply to a certain goal, and I think that we don't have those tools. We don't have access to those tools to allow and encourage and support someone who's staying in a house where the housing cost is X amount relative to their income, their interest, their family size. I think that's I feel very, very ill-equipped. I love the idea, but it's almost like world peace, in Evanston. I think it's a great goal. I don't know that we're the body to we can say we want it. I don't know that we have what it would take at our disposal to make it a reality.
I mean, I think at least what I've heard, if I'm trying to summarize it, is that there's general consensus that the current proposal at least has the ability to destabilize these neighborhoods. I feel like there's consensus there. I feel like we've also found consensus that the solution should come from a defined goal and problem that isn't outlined in the plan currently. So there should be some kind of goal and metric, and maybe this destabilizing force is not even necessary to achieve that goal. Or maybe it can be achieved in a way that's more compatible, and I don't know that you have to spell out the specifics beyond that necessarily.
Bingo. That's it. I completely agree with what you said. I think it does feel like we've reached consensus on like destabilization, so I love what you're going to put down. I think it is hard to have this conversation before land use has or council has figured out exactly their goals through the comprehensive plan. It's hard for us to have this conversation before they've finalized the goals for themselves. Anyway, but I do think they should rethink having that blanket, for 4 units across the residential areas as allowable. And that's for them to maybe figure out, because that's not what we do here. But
I would like to just say, for the record, I think it's great that we're having this conversation. It's hard.
Yeah.
But what it does is sort of add to their conversation, that they're not going to be able to say now that they didn't know that we were interested in this. That this is, it says in the ordinance that our mandate covers neighborhood stabilization. And we're going to say to them that this is an issue. So they're going to have to deal with it. Once they make the changes, then we may have to have another conversation. But the fact that we're talking about it now, even though it's hard, is a good thing. Thomas, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I think what I was going to say is I think the brevity that Cade expressed, when something's as important as this, it's really important to keep it short and sweet so that it gets heard.
All right, so if you all are comfortable with that, there were other things that we talked about earlier in this meeting where we went into some detail, and we wanted a more robust kind of conversation. But in this particular case, it sounds like we're okay with something different, which is totally fine with me.
There are, I've got a laundry list of little things, but I'm not going to say them other than to sum up. And we didn't receive a draft of a zoning ordinance. We received parts of a draft of a zoning ordinance. And so I think it's just criminal that we're asked to weigh in on this when there's a lot of stuff that could have huge implications. And so I'm not going to go into the weeds, but as an architect, I'm used to really going through the nitty-gritty of zoning, and it really does impact how buildings end up looking and the character of neighborhoods. And so I'm just curious, when are they going to do that? How can they ask people to weigh in on something when they don't have the whole thing? And I can go into more detail if you want, but it's just it's not complete. There's a lot of stuff that really determines what buildings look like that's just not in here.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I don't have an answer for you. I can try to get one about when we
And express
anticipate
a degree of
Disappointment.
disappointment.
No, that's fair, and that's, one of the reasons why we needed to have this meeting too, was to identify and be on the record that these things are missing and that we want to see them.
I mean,
And that we believe that they're important.
exactly. And I think that one of the big things, you said for neighborhoods, but I think for our downtown, the planned development section of the zoning wasn't given to us. We weren't given that, and that can dictate a lot of things. What's going to happen with our historic resources in the downtown, and how are we going to be part of that process? I know currently that when there is a landmark property on a site for a planned development, that they come to the Preservation Commission for advisory, using our advisory roles so that we can weigh in on how that resource is affected, and then it goes to the land use. I don't know if that process is going to continue or if it's going to be a different process. So, it's hard to tell when we don't have it in front of us.
Well, isn't that what the Land Use Commission basically said?
Yeah.
That they're tabling the whole zoning issue until they complete I think that we are so far out of sync with this. I don't know if anyone has seen the new park on Central Street that has all the concrete right up to the street.
Yes.
Totally changed the character of that place forever, or at least in my lifetime. And created a huge area of concrete without shade, no shade trees. I think there are a lot of people who want the freedom to do that. I think we're so far out of whack that I think they need another year, because all the other commissions and all the other boards and everybody else is in the same position. There's just, we need a year more.
I think they've floated a balloon with this piece of the zoning code, and now they're hearing back from us. So anyway, we have a consensus on this question. I have a few other things to say about the zoning code, but you have more things
I
to.
have a few, and one comes up similar to what Carl was saying. One of the things that came up pretty consistently when I spoke to people on this commission was that the zoning ordinance is a much more public-facing document than a preservation ordinance. The current zoning ordinance makes a lot of cross-references to the preservation ordinance, so that a homeowner or somebody that knows to look in the zoning ordinance is then aware that there are additional requirements. That's something that was omitted from the proposal currently. So should the proposed zoning ordinance include reference in each of the district standards that properties designated as a landmark or located within a historic district are ultimately subject to and controlled by the requirements of the preservation ordinance and not the zoning ordinance, and provide links. And there's a few similar issues here that were brought up. Should language associated with subdivisions, zoning variations, special uses, and planned developments include language like properties that are landmarks or historic districts require review and recommendation by the commission? The existing zoning ordinance currently includes standards for review of variations in planned developments as they relate to historic properties. The proposed ordinance does not, and should these be included? Maybe I'll leave it. Oh, and then this one that's also related. Should the code include standards for planned developments and major variations that ensure proposals do not result in a loss of significant architectural or historical resources? Those are current standards that we have in the zoning ordinance that are proposed to not be included, at least as explicitly. So we get your feedback on those.
I'm going to show myself as a wonk. I think it's section 2883 of the current city code that references what you're talking about. And I think we do need to notify landmark property owners and people in the historic district that they need to come to the Preservation Commission, and it should be linked in the document. I think that should be included in the document anywhere possible, that we should let people know you have a historic resource, and this is what the process is when you have a historic resource, because either in a flow chart or something that is very easy to understand, because city code can get wonky, it can get hard for just the average homeowner to understand, and distilling it into a graphic would help.
One of the things, Cade, that you mentioned, so I agree with what Carl said on that. One of the things, Cade, that you mentioned was about clarifying and articulating, being very upfront about creating a plan or providing a plan for what happens when the zoning code and the preservation ordinance are, come together, and that the preservation ordinance takes precedent. I did not see really anything in the code as we have it right now that would indicate that. And there were little tiny moments here and there. Every time I saw one, I was like excited. But it needs to be very clear, repeated. Like, redundancy is good. Repeat it a lot. That, that these zoning codes are applicable where there are not districts, and that the district obligation or the landmark obligations are, superseded.
Yeah, I agree that that's really important. I think there's a lot of misperceptions about the roles of the two in the community, and the way that I have always tried to explain it is that the zoning essentially creates a framework for you to then enter the preservation process. And just because you're compliant with that zoning framework doesn't mean that you're meeting the preservation standards. So just because you're meeting the bulk controls for that district doesn't mean you're meeting the standard related to scale of a structure. And so I think that does need to be pretty explicit. In the current ordinance, at least my understanding, I talked to Carlos about it. That was a specific amendment, I believe, to the existing ordinance at one time because there was misunderstanding and miscommunication between the two.
I mean, you know, just because it says that you can build a 35-foot building doesn't mean that you're gonna be able to build a 35-foot building in a district. That's like not a thing.
Well, these documents, they're two separate documents, the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. Will both of those be adopted at, well, we know the ordinance will be, the zoning code will be approved by ordinance. Will the comprehensive plan also be approved by ordinance?
I'd have to check. I'm not really sure if it's just accepted and placed on file as city policy or if it's actually, you know, adopted by ordinance. But, you know, the typical process is that there's consensus on the comprehensive plan and there's consensus on its policies and actions because that's what informs the zoning piece.
Yeah, but zoning is law.
Well, correct, and that's the implementation tool. So, I think that's what you heard from the Land Use Commission was that they want to get the comprehensive plan done first. They want consensus on the policy statements, the action statements, because they can't even say if the zoning is appropriate or not because they haven't agreed to the general framework of the comprehensive plan.
So that the zoning expresses the comprehensive plan.
Correct.
It
As opposed to the other way
executes
around.
Yes, it executes.
And that's right.
But we have to have it but that has to be explicitly in the zoning code for it to have any force of enforcement.
Well, there's just the inherent connection. So you're adopting the zoning ordinance that the Land Use Commission recommended approval and the City Council agreed to, let's assume, and they're saying this implements our vision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, vision is one thing, but $10 million is another thing. So when the person who's interpreting the code before City Council has a lot of money tied up in it, in a building or whatever, they're going to fight for that as opposed to the reference in the comprehensive plan that may be adverse to their interest.
You know, this was the reason why we wanted to spend some time with the comprehensive plan, because that's the like starting point for what justify, and like Thomas's comment about what does it say in the comprehensive plan about what we need, and then what is the zoning code doing to respond to that need. That's the way to think about it. What does the comprehensive plan say? That's why it's really important. What are the policies? Because the policies are why we have the zoning code to begin with. But when you get to the zoning code, you know, that's the thing that people use. Right. And so that it needs to say there very clearly that preservation is not just like an extra. It supersedes. But anyway, I think we have consensus on this, so we can.
Yes, but I feel like I have questions about certain proposed zoning districts. Is that fine to ask a question about that, or?
Yeah, I think.
Kate has some more.
I think
prompts.
I think we can. I don't have too many more. I do have some specific to. We've addressed some of this, but the downtown, which maybe will influence some of your talking points. But one thing that came up pretty significantly was that one thing that was positive in the zoning framework was that there is at least an effort for the zoning to be a companion piece in restricting development potential, at least in the proposed D1 areas, and it explicitly calls out the fact that these locations have, I think it says potentially historic resources or traditional human-scaled fabric within them. One of the questions that came from Beth that couldn't be here is, should that same language be included in the lower density residential and mixed-use categories, so that we're also at least stating that there are significant resources here, whether they're landmarked or not. And then the question was, are there additional areas within the downtown that should be covered under that D1 zoning. And I think when I looked at at one of the Land Use Commission meetings, there was like a chart of existing and proposed, and the proposed D1 matches the current D2. The only places where I don't see them being overlaid and overlapped are, and maybe I can pull up the zoning code, but it's portions of North Sherman, Elgin, and Benson. Let me see if I can pull it up, which were currently zoned D2 and are now zone D3, I believe, which is the highest designation for the downtown. Let me see if I can pull it
While
up.
Kate is trying to find that, I just wanted to, I believe what you're talking about for D1 is on page 17, where it says some of which may have historical significance. Page 17, it's 6.3.10, downtown D1. In the little A section, it says blah, blah, some of which may have historical significance. So it identifies that was actually something that I saw too.
So these are the
So is it the light blue that's D1, right?
the light blue, very light blue properties are D1.
Okay.
They're almost imperceptible here. This is Fountain Square in this location. So these were.
So is it along Sherman Avenue that
It's
is
these,
currently
it's
the?
these locations here, and portions of these locations as well were ones that came up
Okay.
that were previously D2 and are now proposed, which was I believe, the second lowest, or maybe even the lowest development potential in the downtown, which are now proposed as the highest.
Because I know there was a discussion at the land use about transitioning from the downtown into residential neighborhoods, and how do you do that, and can you do it? I mean, because some people are okay with having a cliff, big drop off from a downtown to a residential district, and some people on the commission for one of the recent developments did not like the idea of splitting a block, like where one side was allowing for downtown development and another to be transitional. They thought that it should be, the whole block should be in one zoning district. And how do you address the transition? I mean, the old plan has like the wedding cake thing where you start in the center with the top and the tallest, and then you zone down to the residential district, or, I mean.
I don't know. Somebody else wants to comment on that. I'm still on historical significance and the fact that it was actually mentioned.
Because I think that does, I mean, our downtown is drastically different than it was historically, but we still have significant resources downtown that are tall. We have the international style building, that's the Chase building. We have the Carlson building. We have, so I'm just wondering, because we do have historic tall buildings, and I'm just wondering, how do we maintain the character of a downtown and then allow for transition into residential neighborhoods?
Should also just clarify in the purview of the commission reasons, those areas the aforementioned areas, there are almost all of those properties are listed as eligible in the downtown. I think the current study list has somewhere around 60 properties in the downtown and downtown adjacent, kind of higher density or mid-density residential areas. I think that's where they identified about 60 properties.
What caught my attention with this thing for D1, where it said some of which may have historical significance, is the acknowledgement that historical significance is a factor that can and should be incorporated into this, and which is not right now, except for this one particular location. But that's separate from height and transition, my comment.
I just wonder if mapping the eligible properties informs some of the zoning decisions, perhaps.
Certainly it could. I think that that could be something we say to them, that we would like to see that attempted at least. Because there's no evidence in what we were given that they took any of this into consideration, except for this one sentence in this one thing.
And the other thing to consider is, if we're going to build tall, the downtown is then visible along certain corridors for a very long distance. You can stand at Main Street in Chicago and see buildings downtown. So that then changes the whole viewscape of a corridor. And should that be taken into account too, of a viewscape of a commercial corridor? Standing in Raymond Park, on Hinman, right in front of the church, and you're looking west. Now there's a development that's above the historic churches on Chicago Avenue, and that completely changes the view of the neighborhood. And so should viewscape be a consideration?
So that would be fine with me. I mean, if we're looking for feedback to provide, it sounds like we have a little consensus on taking some of the existing historical patterns into consideration, incorporating some, we'll say, what would it be? Something like significant views or something like that, some view sheds into consideration. Like, this is our opportunity to guide the revisions on this thing, so let's say it.
Our visual heritage.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a small thing, actually. It's not considered often, but I had a few other things. Let me ask you a question. It's 10:30. How do you guys want to keep going? I mean, what?
I think there's a significant value to this thing we're talking about, because if you're talking about, we were talking about the economic value of whatever. I think that you can make it ugly or you can make it beautiful. Most things are kind of in between, but there's no. I think the goal should be, and I think any architect knows this. Nothing in the visual world happens in a void. When I design a landscape, I know that the neighbor's yard is part of the visual experience. It's of course, I think Chicago has done a great job of skylines, I think, in allowing architecture to be a very beautiful part of the whole experience. And we have a responsibility to kind of, if we're going to have a sense of, I don't say smallness, but a sense of intimacy of a community of Evanston, that's something that we have a responsibility to try to preserve.
Do you feel that you have enough of that feedback for putting something together?
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
I have more questions on other.
No, but I mean on
for
this.
this.
On
Okay.
this
Okay,
topic.
sure.
Do you feel that on this particular topic we have covered it enough?
Yeah, I think so. Just to summarize so we're clear, I think what I'm hearing is that the desire is to at least demonstrate that more historic or traditional patterns of development are being considered when these decisions are being made, and that includes view sheds in addition to physical buildings.
Did you have another prompt or two? Okay. You want to go ahead, Carl? I have a
Yeah.
few things too.
Well, I just have a question about the university zoning. They don't, how does that work? Do they get permits pulled for work on their campus within their districts? Because on our study list are 3 brutalist-style buildings that are now historic. The university building behind Deering, Pickstaker, and the, what's the music department. I'm forgetting the name of the Norris Center. So that's kind of like a little cluster of brutalist buildings, and I'm concerned that if we don't identify that as like a significant 1970s addition to the campus, that there could be significant alteration to those, and then affect that experience of being in those brutalist buildings.
They do come for permits, right? They have to get permits.
They do. The university comes for permits. I think it's a little harder. I'll have to get back to you because I don't know the complexity of the university's zoning specifically, but I think it's a little harder because it might be hard to parse out those properties without like split zoning them or creating kind of uncomfortable scenarios. But I think, yeah, the point is well taken that those buildings were identified by the state preservation office as being eligible for the National Register, and that's what put them on our list.
So then my follow-up is, as a result of the federal court case where Northwestern University sued the city of Evanston based on a historic district, there is a consent decree from a federal judge about zoning districts. Can we change, as a city, can we change the zoning district without going to that federal judge and addressing the consent decree?
I don't know the answer. I'll have to get back to you.
Because part of that is the western side of Sheridan Road has a lot of those former historic homes that are now housing departments, various departments. And in the zoning diagnostic report, that's a whole nother report that we're not discussing, they discussed the fact that potential for student housing has been pushed into the residential neighborhood, potentially because those university zones do not allow for denser student housing because the university policy is to have two freshmen and sophomores on campus. And then, so that's my question, is like changing that zoning and the federal, consent decree and the whole thing with student housing going into the residential neighborhoods outside of campus.
Okay, so something that Carl said about student housing, I just want to connect it to something that Thomas said earlier about the number of people coming to the population increasing. And I would be interested in knowing how much of the population increase is Northwestern students. That is, that number that's being sort of folded into Evanston's, like the goal number. If a certain percentage of that is going, like a significant enough percentage of that annual population increase is actually Northwestern, then that is even more of a reason to be looking at the zoning situation in the areas around the university. There's a lot of homes in that area that could be under pressure to become multifamily. In other words, are there areas of the city that are going to have proportionally larger increases in population over time?
So you would say that's a really good point, and so it would be good to have more information about those statistics so that the proposed zoning can be validated.
Right, so that it's not just like a number. They get a little bit more granular about where we think.
Because if this is students, ostensibly, it's a lot more people that are, one individual who needs a unit rather than a family of 5.
Right. It's quantitative, but it's also qualitative at the same time. That's what I was trying to get to.
So the other thing to consider is the bus route or pattern of mobility of students throughout the city. They currently have a shuttle bus that starts at South Boulevard and goes all the way up Chicago to the campus. And they stop routinely going north on. And so that has then driven student population to live as far south as South Boulevard. And so does that have an effect on transit-oriented development and student, some kind of housing along that corridor?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to neighborhood destabilization and displacement and everything, like, are we going to start seeing in those areas, these multifamily that they're allowed to do now? That kind of thing. Talking about the university zoning, I noted that in U1 and U2, there were passages that said something like, where the district is located, sort of near lower scale stuff, it said, sensitive site design is required to minimize impacts on the surrounding neighborhood. Did you guys notice this?
And what does that mean?
That's U1, U2, where adjacent to lower density, ... the scale of this development shall be reduced to provide a transition. In other words, these folks, for the U1 and U2, this code is actually starting to approach the kinds of things that we've been talking about. Like, it is possible to do that. That's why I say there were like moments where abutting or across the street, the uses in this district shall be designed to minimize adverse impacts. So I think that what I would like to suggest is that, where there is a will, there is a way. And I would like to suggest that preservation become a will. Like, preservation is like worth putting statements like this into the zoning code.
And I mean, when I saw that, what does that mean? Like it needs to be quantified.
Oh, yeah,
to have
it needs to
teeth.
be clarified and quantified and all the things. But we're talking about, what I just read to you was U1, U2, and the C1 Creation and Innovation District. There is nothing like that in other parts of the zoning code. R1, all the Rs, but we know that it is possible that they have language that says this.
What was the adverse they was referred to in that statement?
Minimize adverse impacts. Adverse impact is a term that we use, that some people use in preservation, that is like, because there could be positive impacts, but what they mean is adverse impacts. Are you asking what page?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Just to clean that up. Adverse.
Yeah, but that's adverse impacts is a term from, from environmental impact reports and stuff like that. That's a standard. Yeah, that's like that jargon that we should really, on the commission, make sure that the public understands.
It's one of the zoning criteria too. When they apply for zoning relief, they have to. There's one criteria they evaluate whether there's adverse impact on neighbors and things like that.
Yeah, that's a standard thing in preservation. I wanted to just note are we okay with this so far, and we still have consensus on stuff? I wanted to just note that although they said all nice, beautiful things about adaptive use in the comprehensive plan, I didn't see anything in the zoning code about that. And so it's actually, I think it's even defined. It's in the definitions, but then there's nothing there. So in the implementation chapter, in the however the zoning code gets revised, it seems to me that there could be some, support for adaptive use in this.
Didn't they create a special zone for Harley Clark, an adaptive reuse zone thing?
So you couldn't create a separate zone for that purpose, but you can have an adaptive use code section that allows for additional flexibility in all zoning districts, if that makes sense. And that's what we currently have. Mm-hmm. And that's how that project intends to be facilitated, yeah. Mm-hmm. Correct, yeah.
It just gives you a little bit more flexibility, more things you can do, which other projects, if there are not adaptive use, would not be able to do. So I just think we need to really fight to make sure that adaptive use stays in this zoning, survives the zoning code. It should have more of a presence in the comprehensive plan for sure, but it definitely needs to be very present in zoning code. Adaptive use is actually, there are some architecture schools that don't even teach preservation anymore. What they're teaching is adaptive use. Like that's actually, like the terminology is shifting to adaptive use or adaptive reuse. So, we need to be on that train, I think.
So to follow up to definitions, it would be great to just verify and check and make sure that the definitions in the preservation ordinance of like structure, object, blah, blah, all those things are the same as what's in the zoning code. So that we are in alignment with the new zoning code.
I think that's a good comment.
Yeah, I will definitely explore that further. I could see situations where they might have different meanings in terms of zoning and preservation, but it's definitely something that we can explore.
Well, because I just don't want it to be a sticking point where someone's like, what, where you have competing definitions and you don't know which one to go with.
I think there might have been somewhat competing definitions between the two for how a public way might be defined, for example. And maybe there's even just reference in those definitions that definitions may vary in the preservation ordinance or something, and that's what controls or something. I'm sure it's something we can explore.
Well, we were talking about when this is in conflict with the preservation ordinance, that the preservation ordinance prevails.
At least for design.
For design, yeah, but
Yeah.
it could also extend to definitions. Thomas, were you going to say something? I saw you out of the corner of my eye. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's 10:45. We've been sitting here for a while.
I just have a couple of
Go
quick
ahead.
things.
Sure.
The net increases, although not huge in lot coverage, so what there was in the zoning to look at was impervious surface numbers and lot coverage. And impervious surface only went up and lot coverage only went up. And so that's at odds with concerns about stormwater runoff. And I think the way that you can tie that to preservation is a lot of older buildings, a lot of older homes have brick and stone foundations, which are particularly susceptible to groundwater issues. And so that's just, they're not doing what they said they were going to do in the comprehensive plan.
So I'm all for that.
Could that apply to setback in some way also? It's only because the more drainage you have around the site, or of course it could work the other way. So, but I find those two issues tied: permeable, non-permeable surface, and no setback.
I didn't do a close side-by-side comparison, but I didn't see setbacks changing that much. It seemed like it was mostly just like going from 30 to 35 or 40 to 45%. And even if impervious didn't change, but you're increasing the amount of building that can be built, you're still increasing the amount of impervious. Not every project is always going to max out impervious. If you're short by 600 feet and you make your building 200 feet bigger than it could have been before, that's 200 more feet of impervious surface. So it's just inconsistent with the comprehensive plan.
I think that was one, before Stuart left, one of his points that I think is part of this conversation is, at least for the R1 designation, I think the impervious remains the same. The lot coverage jumps by 5%. His point, which I didn't even catch, was there's also that exemption for garages. So there's a 480 square foot exemption. And so if that bulk isn't split now between an accessory structure and principal structure, the actual increase in bulk for that principal structure is much higher.
Right. So there's the garage, and that gets into the finer grain stuff, but there's also breaks for back decks and front porches and things like that the new zoning just kind of dropped.
So there is a October 11th memo on landscaping and green space that goes into all of that. So I'll just let you know that there is a whole memo that discusses
The
minimum of green space and permeable
That's
lot
a fair,
coverage.
and that's a good caveat, and I'm not as well versed with that document, but there is a separate, or they at least the intent to have a separate set of landscape design standards that might control some of these issues in addition to the zoning ordinance. But I think right now, kind of the connection with those two might be kind of confusing.
I thought that what Thomas was saying about the brick and masonry foundations is a good way to frame it for our purposes, because that's very real. Somebody, I have one of those. I wanted to. Some of this conversation was reminding me of a comment that I had on the comprehensive plan, which I didn't say earlier because I thought maybe it was just me. One of the things about the comprehensive plan is that it says things without providing footnotes. It doesn't give the reader an opportunity to look at the kind of raw, underlying kind of, it's not just data, but just sort of foundational materials that this thing is based on. So we have a lot of questions about, well, what is this and where did this come from? And I pulled out a few of those too. So I don't know what can be done about that.
I mean,
just
staying
going
inside of
back-
our wheelhouse, we could just request, advise that like our section, provide footnotes, which provides, a little bit of, there's a standard there that clearly, implicitly, you're not meeting in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's, those of us, if you're going to talk to somebody who's a historian, okay, they want to know. I'm not talking about footnoting every single thing as if it's your doctoral dissertation. I'm just saying, like,
But there's a lot of frustration out there about these big consulting firms that come in and basically just hand us boilerplate nothing.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
that's
that's
what
what they're doing at all.
well, it kind of is.
Okay, yeah, I know. But, I mean, I have somebody on my board, the Southeast Evanston Association, who ran a cursory, match on a bunch of different contracts. And, Raleigh is here, and Portland is there, and a bunch of other cities. Like, we're paying for language that is not unique to us.
Right, and so
A
when.
lot of money.
No, I know. I've seen this many times before and worked with consultants who did this, and I was like, but when they pull, the point is when they pull from different places, the material that it kind of gets disconnected from the source, like literally and figuratively. The notes, the basis for all these statistics, all the questions that Thomas was asking, those get kind of lost. And so you have this kind of abstraction with the veneer of legitimacy and without a kind of core foundational documentation that would help us to have these kind of conversations. So as a historian, I want to see that stuff. I don't know, if maybe we can just say, look, our chapter has some problems, and we'd like to see the footnotes for it, but.
Can I just make a quick comment about, we talked about destabilizing neighborhoods before, and affordability and things. I mean, I definitely want to see the city relook at density and how they not just put a blanket, 4 flats across, but think about areas where more density makes the most sense. So I think they talk about centers and corridors, so maybe expand on that a little. And then in terms of adaptive use, which you mentioned, I mean, I think they need to, in terms of like affordability, destabilizing and affordability, that's a lot of the conversation that the land use talked about. And some of the comments was about, or I heard someone comment, a land trust is a good way to secure affordable housing, or even like, I would love to see, some of the public comment today mentioned the Civic Center here, adaptive reuse. And I mean, I don't know what they're going to do and nobody does, but even if the city thinks about affordable housing with some of the many properties that they currently own, I know that's not our purview, but I'm just thinking about destabilization and how ways we can stabilize neighborhoods and provide affordable housing. I think they need to go a little deeper and explore some of these other tools that might be at their disposal.
And this gets back to something we said earlier. I didn't mean to turn the conversation to the comprehensive plan per se, but but, just being more robust and providing some of the detail and justifications. Did you have more, or did anybody have more that they wanted to say about the zoning code? Sure.
Under D1, they have this, wait, that's not the one, sorry. Under U1, they have this great thing that says required, site design is required to minimize impacts on the nope, that's not it either, sorry.
That was the part that I was
U2,
reading
yes,
earlier, yeah.
U2. Where adjacent to lower density residential districts, the scale of the development shall be reduced to provide a transition. Shouldn't that be on every one of these?
Yeah, that was one of the ones that I was
Yeah.
reading earlier too, that they have the potential to do that. They only did it for a couple of them.
Right, but it
But
should
they
be under R1 and R2.
Yeah.
it was only under the university, is that right?
Yeah.
University and
Two.
creative and innovative district, but there's the will to do it there.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying
Yeah, it's
earlier.
curious why
So I
those were
want-
called out,
I
not
was gonna-
residential.
Yeah. So just raise the importance of preservation.
I think
of it.
that's the what are they calling it now? Creative and,
Creation and innovation district.
creative, and I think that that's stemming back to the environmental justice aspect of this zoning code, is that on Church Street, there's the transfer station right next, and there's housing like smack dab right there. And so I think that sensitive transition is that environmental justice part.
Yeah.
But I agree that it should be in other zoning districts, but I think that was the genesis of that.
Yeah, no,
inclusion.
I think it's great. It's just that, if we're going to sit here and go, well, can they do that? I mean, here's evidence that they
Right,
can, and they have in certain circumstances. And what I'm hoping that will come, one of the many things I'm hoping will come out of this meeting that we're having tonight is the, communicating the desire to have that be, more global.
Right. The only other thing was the definitions, and I might have an old copy. I have 1126, but they're, in particular, the dwelling unit. We've talked about it so many times in these meetings, of the scale of it to the house, especially in preservation. And it just says it has to be smaller than the existing house.
Or you might ADUs.
ADUs, sorry. What did I say? Oh,
Well,
sorry.
currently,
ADUs.
it's set at 1,000 square feet, I think, which, but I'm not sure, it's not in that number, yeah.
That's one of the
Disappeared.
bits of zoning that just disappeared. I mean, sure, it's coming, but be nice to know what that is.
All right, so I think we have some consensus on some of these other things. Was there anything else that we needed to talk about tonight? Like, obviously, we're going to have more, there will be more conversations about this, but we needed to make our voices clear. Are we good?
I was just going to say, go team, thank you
Okay.
for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, it was good. Okay, I'm going to adjourn. Do we have consensus about adjourning? Yes, okay. Good night, everybody.